Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. The first day of May 2013 dawned bright and warm over Bedford, Texas, carrying all the gentle promise of a North Texas spring. As evening settled over an apartment on Park Place Avenue, the familiar sounds of family life filled the air. 30-year-old Roxanne Sanchez was surrounded by the voices of her world. 12-year-old Marcus with his quiet, serious nature. 8-year-old Anthony, bursting with boundless energy, and baby Isaiah, just 8 months old, cooing softly in her arms. Their small apartment held everything that mattered. It was their sanctuary, alive with the beautiful chaos that only a young family can create. But tonight, something dark was about to shatter that peace. A storm of anger and resentment had been brewing in the heart of someone Roxanne had once trusted completely. Cedric Allen Ricks. At 38, Ricks worked as a medical assistant. To the outside world, he seemed charming, capable, professional. But behind closed doors, he was someone entirely different. The women closest to him knew the truth. They'd seen his explosive temper, felt the sting of his words that could turn cruel without warning. Roxanne knew this side of him all too well. Their relationship had given them Isaiah, their beautiful baby boy. But love had curdled into something toxic. Their common-law marriage was crumbling under the weight of Rick's volatile nature, leaving them trapped in an increasingly dangerous dance. The argument began the way so many do, over something small and meaningless. The exact words have been lost to time, but their impact was devastating. Something inside Cedric Ricks finally snapped. The mask of the caring partner, the medical professional, simply fell away. What remained was pure, terrifying rage. His footsteps grew heavy as he moved toward the kitchen with deadly purpose. His hand found the handle of a knife, and in that moment, everything changed forever. Roxanne became the first target of his fury. The argument exploded into violence, then into something far worse. He attacked her with the blade, striking again and again as she fought desperately for her life. Her cries of terror and pain echoed through their small home. Those sounds drew her sons running. Anthony, just 8 years old, and Marcus, barely 12, rushed to help their mother. Their eyes filled with a horror no child should ever witness. Their love and loyalty sealed their fate. Ricks, consumed by an unstoppable rage, turned on the boys. Little Anthony was no match for the man's savage attack. The small boy fell, his life slipping away on the floor of the place he'd called home. Then came Marcus's turn. Though only 12, he tried to fight back, tried to defend himself like a grown man. He raised his hands, desperately trying to shield himself from the flashing blade. The knife found him 25 times, cutting his hands, his neck, his chest, his back. As darkness began to close in around him, as his strength faded, Marcus heard something that cut through his pain and terror. The sound his little brother Anthony had made in those final moments. A terrible, liquid gurgling as life left him. With incredible presence of mind, Marcus made that same sound. He pretended to be gone, and miraculously, it worked. Cedric Ricks believed his work was complete. The storm of his rage finally passed, leaving behind unspeakable destruction. He stood in the sudden quiet, surrounded by the bodies of the woman he'd claimed to love, and the children who'd called her mom. The man who'd entered that apartment was gone, replaced by something monstrous. The silence that followed felt more terrifying than the violence itself. Marcus lay motionless on the floor, his body covered in wounds, listening to every sound. He heard water running in the shower. He heard Ricks moving through the apartment, changing clothes, tending to his own minor injuries, packing a bag. Each minute felt like forever. Each noise brought fresh waves of fear. Would he come back? Would he realize the deception? Then Marcus heard the sound he'd been praying for, the front door closing. Cedric Ricks was gone. Drawing on strength he never knew he had, Marcus pushed himself up from the floor. Blood covered everything. The pain from his wounds felt like fire consuming his entire body. He stumbled past the still forms of his mother and little brother, an image that would haunt him forever, and somehow found the phone. With trembling, clumsy fingers, he dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, the voice that spoke was weak, small, belonging to a child who had just looked evil in the face and survived. He told them what had happened. He gave them a description of Cedric Ricks. He told them the man was driving Roxanne's car. Then, his duty done and his strength exhausted, he collapsed. Help was on its way. As Marcus lay waiting for the sirens, Cedric Ricks was driving north, putting miles between himself and the horror he had left behind. He was a fugitive now, but his mind wasn't on escape. It was on confession. Using his cell phone, he made 2 calls. He called his family in a calm, chilling monotone. He told them what he had done. "I killed Roxy and her boys," he said. He asked them to go to the apartment and get his infant son, Isaiah, the one child he had spared. His relatives, horrified and disbelieving, didn't go to the apartment. They hung up the phone and dialed 911. The 2 calls, one from a heroic dying boy, the other from a remorseless killer, converged at the Bedford Police Department, painting a picture of unimaginable horror. When police and paramedics breached the door of the apartment on Park Place Avenue, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Roxanne Sanchez and Anthony Figueroa were gone, their bodies bearing the brutal marks of a savage attack. And on the floor, barely clinging to life, was Marcus, a child who had endured an assault that should have killed him. He was airlifted by helicopter to Cook Children's Medical Center, his condition critical, his survival a minute-by-minute battle. While surgeons fought to save Marcus's life, law enforcement began the hunt for his attacker. The confession calls from Ricks had given them a powerful tool, his cell phone signal. They began to trace the pings, and a clear path emerged. He was heading north on the interstate, away from Bedford, away from Tarrant County, possibly making a run for his home state of Illinois. The information was relayed to law enforcement agencies along the route. Just after 11 p.m., less than 3 hours after the murders, 2 troopers with the Oklahoma Highway Patrol spotted the vehicle. Roxanne Sanchez's car, traveling north about 70 miles across the Texas-Oklahoma border. They pulled him over. Cedric Ricks, his hands stained with the blood of his family, offered no resistance. He was arrested and taken to the Garvin County Jail in Oklahoma. The news of the crime for which he'd been arrested traveled faster than the official paperwork. When the other inmates in the Garvin County Jail learned what Ricks had done, that he had murdered a woman and a small child and nearly killed another, they delivered their own form of brutal justice. Ricks was severely beaten. His face was left a mess of bruises, scrapes, and swollen tissue. When he was eventually extradited and handed over to Bedford police, the physical marks of his time in the Oklahoma jail were plain to see. His face was a mask of contusions, a stark visual representation of the monstrousness of his crimes. He acknowledged to a Tarrant County sheriff's official that the beating had happened at the hands of other inmates. Shortly after the assault, he waived extradition and was returned to Tarrant County, where the specter of the death penalty now loomed over him. The trial of Cedric Allen Ricks, held in May 2014, wasn't a question of guilt or innocence. His confession to his family and the harrowing testimony of the lone survivor had already sealed that question. The trial was about the measure of justice. It was about whether the man who had committed such an act of intimate familial terrorism should forfeit his own life. The prosecution team, led by Christy Jack and Robert Foran, came prepared to paint a portrait of Ricks, not as a man who had snapped in a moment of passion, but as a calculated, remorseless individual with a long and documented history of violence against women. They called to the stand his ex-wife and 2 ex-girlfriends. Each one told a similar chilling story. They characterized Ricks as a dangerous man with an explosive temper, a man whose love was a cage of verbal and physical abuse. Their testimony established a clear and terrifying pattern. The violence that had ended Roxanne Sanchez's life wasn't an aberration. It was an escalation. But the most powerful and gut-wrenching testimony came from the boy who had lived. Marcus Figueroa, now 13 years old, took the stand. He was no longer the critically injured child fighting for his life, but a survivor bearing the physical and emotional scars of a night that had stolen his childhood. In a quiet, steady voice that held the packed courtroom in rapt silence, he walked the jury through the horror of May 1st, 2013. He recounted the argument, the attack on his mother, and the moment Cedric Ricks turned on him and his brother. And then he told them his secret. He told them about the sound his brother Anthony had made and the split-second decision he had made to imitate it. He described how he had made himself go limp, how he had forced himself to be still while the man who was trying to kill him stood over him, deciding his fate. His testimony was a masterclass in courage, a testament to a presence of mind that was nothing short of miraculous. He had outwitted his own would-be killer. The impact of his story was absolutely devastating. Jurors wept openly in the courtroom. The weight of what this child had endured, what he had witnessed, and how he had survived seemed to fill every corner of the room. The prosecution's closing arguments drove the point home with relentless force. This was not a crime of passion. This was cold, calculated extermination. After our ex had finished his brutal work, he hadn't called for help. He hadn't expressed a shred of remorse. Instead, he had calmly taken a shower, changed his clothes, packed a bag, and fled into the night. His actions weren't those of a man caught in the grip of temporary rage, but of a methodical killer desperately trying to cover his tracks. The jury needed less than an hour to reach their decision. On May 8, 2014, they returned with their verdict. Cedric Allen Ricks was guilty of capital murder. The penalty phase began immediately. Now the jury faced a weightier question. Did Ricks represent a future danger to society? Were there any mitigating circumstances that might warrant life in prison instead of death? The prosecution argued with fierce conviction that his history of violence proved he remained a continuing threat. They painted him as a psychopath, a man utterly incapable of remorse or rehabilitation. After 7 long hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their final decision. They sentenced Cedric Allen Ricks to death for the brutal killings of Roxanne Sanchez and 8-year-old Anthony Figueroa. He would pay with his own life. In the years that followed, Cedric Ricks found himself confined to death row, his case winding its way through the slow, grinding labyrinth of the appeals process. His lawyers filed petition after petition, arguing on multiple fronts. They claimed the prosecution had engaged in racial discrimination during jury selection, a challenge known as a Batson claim, which was ultimately denied by the courts. They argued his trial counsel had been ineffective for failing to object when the jury glimpsed him in shackles during the proceedings. This claim was also rejected, with the court noting that Ricks had exposed the restraints himself. Every legal avenue was explored and exhausted, from state appellate courts to the federal system. Every motion was denied. Every appeal was rejected. As the legal challenges dwindled away, the machinery of the state began moving toward its final act. On October 20th, 2025, Tarrant County officials set an execution date. Cedric Allen Ricks, now 51 years old, was scheduled to die by lethal injection on March 11th, 2026. The story of Cedric Ricks is a story that emerges from the darkest corners of domestic violence. A chilling reminder of how quickly a home can transform into a tomb. But it is also, profoundly, a story of survival. It's the story of Marcus Figueroa, a boy who faced down unimaginable evil and, through an act of stunning ingenuity and courage, lived to tell the tale. His survival wasn't just a miracle. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to be silenced. His testimony ensured that the man who had tried to erase his family would be held accountable in the most final way possible. The justice system in this case moved with terrible and inevitable gravity, from a blood-soaked apartment in Bedford to a gurney in the execution chamber in Huntsville. A journey set in motion by a boy who simply refused to die. Story 2. The fall of 2006 was settling over Barrie, Ontario, painting the leaves in brilliant shades of amber and crimson along the shores of Lake Simcoe. In a quiet apartment complex on Coulter Street, the changing season reflected a far more devastating storm brewing within the mind of Frances Elaine Campion. At 33, Elaine found herself adrift, caught in the wreckage of a shattered marriage and a custody battle that had consumed her entire world. Her life, once filled with the promise of simple domestic happiness, had spiraled into a vortex of paranoia, fear, and deep-seated resentment that poisoned everything it touched. At the center of this storm were her two daughters, 3-year-old Serena and 19-month-old Sophia. They were the anchors of her life. And in the twisted reality of her thoughts, they had become the prize in a war she felt destined to lose. Elaine's journey had begun far from the manicured suburbs of southern Ontario, in the quiet rural community of Coes Island, New Brunswick. Her childhood seemed normal enough, but restlessness drove her to Ontario around age 20, seeking work and a fresh start. She found employment as a nanny, a role that suited her well, and took on other jobs to make her way. In 2000, she met Leo Campion. Their relationship blossomed into marriage, and soon they settled in the nearby town of Bradford. The births of their daughters, first Serena, then Sophia, should have cemented their family unit. Instead, cracks began to appear, widening into chasms that would prove impossible to bridge. By 2006, the marriage was over. Leo had moved out, and the couple found themselves entangled in a divorce that was anything but amicable. The primary battlefield, their children. Elaine had moved with the girls to the Coulter Glen apartments in Barrie, but the separation brought no peace. It only intensified the conflict. Leo grew increasingly worried about his daughter's well-being under Elaine's care. He alleged that the living conditions in her apartment were substandard, and more alarmingly, that Elaine was in the midst of a severe mental health crisis. He'd witnessed the signs for months, a slow, terrifying unraveling that now seemed to be accelerating. Elaine's behavior had become erratic and frightening. She'd been hospitalized in psychiatric wards, and court records would later reveal a history of concerning incidents. Her grip on reality was slipping, replaced by a world of terrifying delusions. She believed people were trying to harm her. She was convinced that shadowy figures were plotting to steal her daughters. Her paranoia took on bizarre forms. She forbade Serena from touching anything red and spoke of seeing aliens. To the outside world, these might have seemed like the ramblings of a troubled mind, but to Elaine, they were dire warnings of impending threats. And in her mind, the greatest threat of all was Leo. The custody battle became the crucible where her love for her children and her hatred for her ex-husband fused into a single terrible purpose. Leo, desperate to protect his daughters, had escalated his legal efforts. Just a week before the tragedy, he'd filed a motion with the court, pleading for more access to the girls and demanding the appointment of a children's lawyer to represent their interests. He saw the danger signs, the red flags fluttering violently in the wind of Elaine's instability. A court date was set. It loomed over Elaine, not as a chance for resolution, but as a day of judgment where she was certain she would lose everything. The idea that Leah, the man she now saw as a monster, could win custody of her girls was an unbearable, apocalyptic thought. It was a thought that would curdle into a horrifying resolution. On October 2nd, 2006, inside that Barry apartment, Elaine Campion made a decision. She wasn't just going to prevent Leo from getting the children. She was going to make him pay, to inflict a wound so deep it would never heal. She decided to create a final testament, a monument to her pain and rage. She took out her video camera. The footage she recorded offers a chilling glimpse into a mind on the edge of an abyss. In segments filmed before the act, she speaks directly to the camera, her words a torrent of vitriol aimed at her absent husband. She details his alleged wrongdoings, her voice a mixture of anguish and venom. Then the camera keeps rolling as she turns her attention to her daughters. She coaxes them to play, to say goodbye. Their innocent voices create a haunting counterpoint to the darkness about to engulf them. According to her own account, she then turned off the camera and led her daughters to the bathroom. The room, once a place of bubbles and bath toys, became something unthinkable. One by one, she took Serena and Sophia's lives in that bathtub. But her work wasn't finished. This wasn't just about ending their lives. It was about sending a message. She tenderly dried her daughters' small bodies and dressed them in fresh pajamas. She adorned them with jewelry, then carried them to her own bed, laying them down side by side. Their hands were clasped together as if in eternal sleep. Around them she arranged a rosary and a photo album, creating what looked like a serene, almost angelic scene. It was a disturbing parody of maternal love, a carefully staged tableau designed for maximum impact. Her final act was to turn that same violence upon herself. She attempted to overdose, hoping to join her daughters in the silence she had created for them. But she failed. A day and a half later, she woke up. The first thing she did was turn the camera back on. The living room was bathed in the indifferent light of a new day. I tried to overdose, but it didn't work, she confesses to the lens, her voice breaking with sobs. Those poor girls, they were my life. For a moment, the crushing weight of what she had done seemed to overwhelm her completely. On October 4th, 2 days after she had taken her children's lives, Elaine Campion finally picked up the phone and called the police. When officers arrived, they found the 2 little girls exactly as she had left them. A picture of innocence, frozen in time. In the same room, they discovered the videotape that would later be played at the police station. During her interrogation, she feigned ignorance, pretending she had no idea how her daughters had died. But the videotape told the real story. It was a confession, a motive, and a verdict all in one. It was the evidence that would seal her fate. The trial of Elaine Campion began 4 years later, in the fall of 2010. It lasted 7 grueling weeks, a public dissection of a family's destruction. The prosecution charged her with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The defense, led by lawyer Mary Kramer, didn't dispute the central fact that Elaine had killed her daughters. Their entire case rested on a different argument, that she was not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder. The jury was presented with 2 starkly different portraits of Elaine Campion. The Crown painted her as a vengeful ex-wife, a woman so consumed by hatred that she murdered her own children as the ultimate act of revenge against her husband. They argued the timing was no coincidence. She killed Serena and Sophia just days before the family court appearance where Leah was expected to gain more access to them. The videotape was their star witness. "Leo there. Are you happy?" She sneers on the tape. "Everything's gone. The idea that you could actually have my children. God believes me and God's taking care of them now. You beat your wife to death and your children, and don't you ever, ever, ever forget it. This the prosecution argued, was not the voice of insanity. This was the voice of calculated, cold-blooded revenge. The defense, in turn, built a narrative of a woman broken by abuse and mental illness. They detailed her stays in psychiatric wards, her delusions, her paranoia. They argued that her mental disorder was so severe she was incapable of understanding that what she was doing was morally wrong. In her twisted reality, she wasn't taking her children's lives. She was saving them from what she believed would be a far worse fate, life with their father. One expert for the defense called it an altruistic act, born of profoundly disordered love. The courtroom became a theater of immense sorrow. The jury was shown over 100 photos from the scene. The images of Serena and Sophia lying hand in hand, surrounded by stuffed animals, were so devastating that one juror wept openly. The judge had to call for breaks on 2 separate occasions. Elaine herself broke down, her body shaking with sobs as the evidence of her actions was laid bare. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Their task was immense. They had to navigate the murky waters of the Canadian Criminal Code regarding mental disorder. The law didn't just require them to find that Elaine had a mental illness. They had to decide if that illness rendered her incapable of knowing her actions were wrong by the standards of ordinary society. The deliberations were long and difficult. The jury deliberated for nearly a week, coming back twice with questions for Justice Alfred Stong, struggling with the legal definitions. On the 4th day, they asked for clarification of the phrase, morally wrong. The judge explained that the test wasn't whether Elaine believed her actions were justified in her own mind, but whether she was capable of knowing that society viewed them as wrong. The weight of the decision was overwhelming. One juror burst into tears when she was denied a request to call her son on his 7th birthday, a stark reminder of the childhoods that had been extinguished. Finally, on November 15, 2010, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman delivered the verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Elaine Campion's body began to shake uncontrollably. When the verdict finally landed, it hit like a thunderbolt. She crumbled in the prisoner's box, her sobs echoing through the silent courtroom as she buried her face in trembling hands. The conviction came with an unforgiving price. Life behind bars, with no chance of freedom for 25 years. Even the judge seemed shaken by what he'd witnessed. His voice carried the weight of the unthinkable as he spoke about the tragic web of circumstances that had led them all to this moment. The breakdown of a family, a life spiraling out of control. Then came words that would linger long after the gavel fell. It is more than disconcerting to think that if Miss Campion had not been so abused, so used, and discarded as a person, her 2 daughters could still be alive. The trauma had been so overwhelming that the judge took an extraordinary step, ordering the state to pay for counseling for the jurors themselves. Leo Campion wasn't there to hear the sentence handed down, but his pain filled every corner of that courtroom through words read aloud by the Crown Attorney. Raw. Heartbreaking. Unforgettable. Serena and Sophia were my life, and they still are, he had written. I found my place in life, and my peace was with them. He wrote about images that would never leave him, his daughter's final moments, visions that would haunt me forever in ways I can't begin to describe. He ached for the simple moments stolen from him, the sound of little feet running toward him, their voices calling out, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." His words ended with a father's eternal promise. I will carry them in my heart until we meet again. The family statement painted a picture of emptiness that words could barely capture. The hollow ache of losing Serena and Sophia, something they carried with them every single day. Elaine Campion wasn't ready to accept her fate. She appealed, claiming the judge had fumbled his instructions about the not criminally responsible defense. But in 2015, the Ontario Court of Appeal saw it differently. They dismissed her appeal without hesitation. The court was crystal clear. The trial judge had done his job properly. The jury understood exactly what they needed to decide. The verdict would stand. But the story didn't end there. Years passed, and in 2019, something happened that reopened old wounds. The Parole Board of Canada granted Elaine Campion escorted time away from prison for personal development. And it happened again in the years that followed. For a grieving father in a community forever changed by unspeakable tragedy, these decisions feel like salt in wounds that never quite heal. The legal chapter may have closed, but the story of Serena and Sophia, two little girls caught in a war they never could have understood, remains a reminder of loss that can never, ever be undone. Story 3. The street embodied suburban tranquility, a quiet artery flowing through the heart of Santa Clara, California. Along Valley Way, houses nestled comfortably on their manicured lots, each one a testament to a certain kind of success. The quiet affluence that flows through so much of Silicon Valley was on full display here. Lawns stretched green and perfect, driveways showcased gleaming new cars, and the January sun painted long, peaceful shadows across the pavement. This was a place where life seemed to follow a predictable and prosperous script. For the residents of number 714, a handsome home purchased for just over $2 million the previous April. The script appeared to be nothing short of a fairy tale. But a morning of Tuesday, January 16th, 2024, cracks were beginning to show in that fairy tale's facade. And a friend of the couple who lived there was growing increasingly terribly worried. He had tried calling them, both Lyron Chun and his wife Shwani. The calls went unanswered, each ringing tone echoing into a void of silence that felt more sinister with every attempt. He had sent messages, but those familiar check marks indicating delivery and readership never appeared. This wasn't like them at all. They were professionals, diligent and always connected. Both software engineers at Google, one of the world's most prestigious technology companies. Radio silence simply wasn't in their vocabulary. The friend's unease had taken root the night before. He had been with them, Liren and Shwani, at their home for dinner. It should have been a pleasant evening among peers, three bright, ambitious people who had navigated the demanding journey from top universities in China to the epicenter of the global tech industry. But the atmosphere had felt unsettlingly off. The concern had centered on Liren. The man the friend knew was sharp, engaged, articulate. But the Liren Chun at the dinner table on January 15th was a stranger. He sat quiet and distant, staring blankly, a ghost at his own feast. His presence felt like a vacuum, a hollowed-out version of the man he was supposed to be. The friend had noted what he would later describe to authorities as a noticeable change in Chun's demeanor. It was a quiet alarm bell, a subtle but persistent hum of wrongness that he couldn't shake. Now, standing outside their home, that hum had become a roar. His unanswered calls had led him here, to the front door of 714 Valley Way. He knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. He waited. Nothing. He called out their names. The silence that answered was heavy, absolute. Drawn by deepening dread, he moved to the side of the house, peering through a window into the interior of the life they had built. And then he saw him through the glass. Liren Chun was there, but he was not moving. He was inside the house, motionless, fixed in a bizarre and disturbing tableau. He was on his knees, his hands held up in the air, as if in a gesture of surrender, his gaze empty, staring into a space only he could see. He was like a statue of despair. The friend's heart hammered against his ribs. This was not just wrong, it was a scene from a nightmare. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and dialed 911. It was 10:55 a.m. He reported what he saw, his voice tight with panic. telling the dispatcher that his friend was inside the house, refusing to answer his phone or the door, frozen in that silent, terrifying pose. The quiet tranquility of Valley Way was about to be shattered. The story of Liren Chun and Xuani was, by all external measures, a story of extraordinary success. It was a narrative that seemed to affirm the very promise of the modern meritocracy. A tale of two brilliant minds ascending from the competitive academic landscape of China to the pinnacle of American technology. Their journey was a shared one, their paths intertwined from an early age. Both were academic prodigies, earning their way into Tsinghua University in Beijing, often called the Mid of China. They were graduates of the class of 2018 from the esteemed School of Information Science and Technology, a place that represented the highest echelon of intellectual achievement in the country. Their shared ambition didn't end there. From Tsinghua, they crossed the Pacific to continue their education at the University of California, San Diego, another prestigious institution known for its rigorous engineering and computer science programs. They both pursued graduate degrees, polishing the formidable skills that would make them highly sought-after commodities in the voracious tech market. Their academic pedigrees were impeccable, a matched set of credentials that marked them as the best and brightest of their generation. Their professional lives followed the same gilded trajectory. In 2020, Liren secured a position at Google, the dream destination for countless software engineers. He was assigned to a high-profile team working on the complex recommendation algorithm for YouTube Shorts, a critical component of Google's strategy to compete in the short-form video space. A year later, in 2021, Xuani joined him at the tech giant, having previously worked at another powerhouse, Amazon. Now they were a Google couple, a title that came with more than just handsome salaries. It carried real status in Silicon Valley's fiercely competitive world. They married in 2022, sealing what looked to everyone like the perfect partnership. Equals in brilliance, drive, and success. Their lives read like a carefully crafted success story, every milestone achieved with clockwork precision. Then came April 2023, and their biggest purchase yet, the house at 714 Valley Way in Santa Clara. For $5 million, they claimed their piece of the American dream, a concrete symbol of everything they'd accomplished. This wasn't just property. This was their declaration to the world. It announced they were here to stay, ready to build a life in the country that had rewarded their talents so generously. On Chinese social media and throughout the Chinese-American community, they shone like stars, the golden couple, living proof of what hard work and intelligence could achieve. Their story inspired countless others, a modern success fable come to life. They'd conquered China's brutal national college entrance exam, excelled at one of the world's most prestigious universities, and landed dream jobs at a global tech giant. By every measure that mattered, they had won. But beneath the polished veneer of their LinkedIn profiles and the proud ownership of their new home, a different story was taking shape. Hidden from the world's admiring gaze, unseen pressures were mounting. A darkness was gathering strength, a destructive force that would eventually devour the very fairy tale they seemed to be living. The dinner on January 15th wasn't some random occurrence. It was the breaking point. That blank stare in Lixin Chen's eyes. It was a glimpse into a storm that had been building inside him, a storm about to make landfall in the most devastating way possible. When the first Santa Clara police officer reached 714 Valley Way, the scene matched exactly what the frantic 911 caller had described. Through the window, they could see a man on his knees, hands raised, staring into nothing. A motionless figure in a house that felt disturbingly quiet. The officer's training immediately raised red flags. This could be a hostage situation, a barricaded suspect, or a welfare check about to turn into something much worse. No response came from inside the house. The decision was made. They had to go in. Officers breached the home, moving with the careful precision that unknown dangers demand. Inside, they found Lixin Chen. The man they took into custody didn't resist. That same blank emptiness filled his eyes, a disturbing void that suggested a complete break from reality. But his body told a violent story. His right hand was grotesquely swollen and purple, the hand of someone who'd used it as a weapon. Blood stained his clothing, his legs, his arms, his hands. Fresh scratches marked his arms, likely from a struggle. He was a walking canvas of violence. While officers secured Chen, the rest of the team pushed deeper into the house. In the bedroom, they found the source of all that blood, and the reason for Chen's haunting posture. Xuan Yiyu lay dead on the floor. The scene was absolutely devastating. She had suffered severe injuries to her head from repeated blunt force trauma. The attack had been shockingly brutal. Their bedroom, once the sanctuary of their shared life, had become a scene of unimaginable violence. Blood covered the floor, walls and door, painting a horrific picture of what had happened there. Xuan Yiyu, the brilliant engineer, the other half of that golden couple, lay lifeless in the home she'd bought less than a year before. As first responders treated his injuries, one of them asked Lixin a simple question: how had he hurt his hand? His response was equally simple and absolutely chilling. Stripped of any explanation, any remorse, it was a blunt and terrible confession. "I punched my wife," he said. Then he revealed something even more disturbing. This hadn't happened moments before their arrival, but the day before. For hours, maybe an entire day, he had stayed in that house with the body of the woman he had killed, kneeling in that silent, empty vigil until the outside world finally broke down the door. The aftermath moved swiftly. Lixin Chen was taken from the scene to a hospital for his injuries, then held without bail. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office acted quickly, formally charging him with his wife's murder. The felony complaint was stark and unforgiving, accusing him of a crime committed with clear intent. It included special allegations describing a crime involving extreme violence and acts showing a high degree of cruelty, viciousness, or callousness. The complaint further alleged that the victim was particularly vulnerable, and that Chin had taken advantage of a position of trust or confidence to commit the offense. The ultimate betrayal. If convicted, the 27-year-old former Google engineer would face a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Chun lay in a hospital bed, delaying his initial court arraignment, news of the killing began to spread. A shock wave rippled through the communities that had once celebrated the couple. The story was first picked up by local news outlets, but it quickly went viral. Social media amplified it, along with the high-profile nature of their employer. The initial reporting was marred by confusion and misinformation. This led major national Chinese language newspapers to run front-page stories on January 19th, falsely claiming the event was a murder-suicide. The erroneous reports sparked a media frenzy in the Chinese-speaking world. The story was picked up by national media in China. Unverified rumors also circulated, including a persistent theory that the crime was somehow connected to recent layoffs at Google, a claim that was quickly denied by a colleague of the couple. As the facts slowly solidified, the narrative shifted from sensationalist rumor to horrified disbelief. How could this have happened? The question echoed across online forums and social media platforms. The case became a focal point for a painful and complex discussion about success, pressure, and the unseen struggles that can fester behind a facade of perfection. Netizens and commentators pointed to the phenomenon of excessive elitism in modern Chinese culture, which placed overwhelming emphasis on external markers of success. Top schools, high-paying jobs, prestigious companies. Chun and Yu had been the embodiment of this ideal. Many argued that this relentless focus on resumes and status came at the expense of developing inner qualities like kindness, integrity, and emotional resilience. District Attorney Jeff Rosen, in his official statement, framed the tragedy in a different but equally important context. Domestic violence deaths have been falling in our county, he said. But that does not measure the depth and destructiveness of the violence. Anyone who feels that they or someone else is being abused by their partners, please reach out to your local law enforcement agency. You are not alone. We can help. His words cut through the speculation about careers and societal pressure, pointing to a more fundamental and terrifying possibility. That this was a case of intimate partner violence, a private horror that had finally exploded into public view. As the legal process began its slow march forward, many of the most critical questions remained unanswered. The motive behind the killing was still unknown, a gaping hole at the center of the tragedy. The details of what happened in the hours leading up to the violence, the nature of the couple's relationship behind closed doors, and the psychological state of Liren Chun were all matters that would have to be explored in a court of law. The house on Valley Way, once a symbol of a bright future, was now a crime scene. Months later, in August 2024, it was quietly sold for $2, $1 million to new owners. Its dark history became a footnote in a real estate transaction. But for the families of Liren Chun and Xuanyi, and for the communities that watched their ascent and fall, the story is not over. It is a haunting narrative about the American dream and the nightmares that can sometimes lie beneath its surface. It is a story of two brilliant lives, one brutally extinguished, and the other irrevocably broken. Left behind is a trail of sorrow and the terrible unanswered question of why. Story 4. The world of Charisma Marie Arisman was built on warm embraces and boundless love. Born on a bright September day in 21 to her devoted parents, Christina and Jeffrey Arisman, she was a force of nature from the moment she could speak. Jeffrey fondly remembered taking his little girl to the park, a whirlwind of pure, joyful energy. While other children might hide behind their parents' legs, Charisma would march straight up to a group of strangers, her small face serious with purpose, and ask, "Do you want to be friends with me?" She was never shy, never hesitant. Her father would say she was the most open and outgoing girl you could ever meet, a person who collected friends like others, collected stamps, each one treasured and deeply loved. This natural desire to connect and care for others shaped her life's purpose. From a young age, all Charisma ever wanted was to help people. The path she chose felt like a true calling, nursing. It was perfect for a young woman whose heart seemed to hold infinite compassion. She was fiercely independent, a trait that showed itself in quiet determination. To make her dream real, she worked not one but 2 jobs, carefully saving money and planning for her future. She had recently enrolled at Triton College in River Grove to pursue her nursing studies. True to her independent spirit, she hadn't told her family about returning to school after taking a year off during the pandemic. She waited until her first day of classes, a quiet announcement of a new chapter, begun entirely on her own terms. Life in the Arisman home in Forest View, Illinois was built on trust and open communication. It was a house filled with love, laughter, and the comforting rhythms of a close-knit family. Charisma, with her dreams of stethoscopes and healing hands, was its vibrant, beating heart. She loved simple pleasures, day trips into the city, the thrill of discovering a new coffee shop, the sweet delight of a fancy cupcake. She was a young woman standing at the edge of her future, a wide-open landscape of possibility, a dream path waiting to be walked. No one in that loving home could have imagined that a single winter night would tear a hole in their universe, a wound so deep it would never fully heal. No one could have known that the girl who hugged everyone and said "I love you" so freely was about to vanish into a silence as cold and unforgiving as the January air. Sunday, January 23rd, 2022, began like any other winter day in the Chicago suburbs. The sky stretched like a flat gray canvas, and a biting wind swept through the quiet streets of Forest View. Inside the Arisman home, warmth stood in stark contrast to the chill outside. As evening fell, the house settled into its familiar Sunday rhythm. Charisma was getting ready to go out. She dressed in a tan jacket and black pants, practical choices against the January cold. She gathered her things, slipping them into a small, distinctive pink backpack. At approximately 10:15 p.m., she told her family she was leaving. It was routine, the kind of departure that had happened 100 times before, unremarkable in its normalcy. She stepped out of the warmth of her family home and into the driver's seat of her red 2014 Ford Fiesta. The engine turned over with its familiar hum. The red taillights of her car disappeared down the street, a fleeting splash of color against the deep blue of the winter night. It was the last time her family would see her alive. As the hours stretched on, a quiet unease began creeping into the edges of the night. A few hours turned into several. The familiar sound of her key in the lock never came. Calls to her cell phone, usually answered with her bright, cheerful voice, now went straight to voicemail. Each unanswered call was a small, sharp stab of anxiety. Christina and Jeffrey tried to reason with their growing fear. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she decided to stay with a friend and forgotten to text. But this wasn't Charisma's way. This wasn't the girl who disappeared when upset or stayed somewhere without telling anyone. This was the girl who always texted her mom. By Monday morning, the gnawing anxiety had transformed into full-blown panic. Charisma had missed work. She'd missed her classes at Triton College. The silence from her phone was no longer just unusual. It was ominous. The Arismans knew, with the certainty that only parents possess, that something was terribly wrong. They contacted the Forest View Police Department and filed a missing person report. The words felt foreign and horrifying on their tongues. Their daughter, their Charisma, was missing. We're all just in shock, Jeffrey Arisman would later tell reporters, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. In complete and utter shock. We knew the second she went missing something was wrong, because she doesn't go missing. The moment the report was filed, the machinery of a police investigation began to turn. Officers launched a series of decisive and carefully considered measures, driven by the urgency of finding a missing young woman under suspicious circumstances. The first step was to reach out to those who knew her best. Detectives sat down with Christina and Jeffrey, their questions gentle yet searching, carefully piecing together the puzzle of Charisma's final known hours. They asked about her mood, her friends, her daily routines. Had there been any recent changes in her behavior? Any conflicts or disagreements? The parents, their world suddenly spinning off its axis, answered every question they could. Their minds raced through recent memories, desperately searching for a clue, a sign. Anything they might have overlooked. Investigators spread out across the city, speaking with Charisma's wide circle of friends and acquaintances. But each conversation led to the same frustrating dead end. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her since that Sunday night. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echo of her smile and the cherished memories of those who loved her. The possibility that Charisma had run away was considered. It always is in such cases. Detectives tried to explore the hidden corners of her personal life, searching for any secret turmoil that might have prompted her to leave. But her parents immediately and passionately rejected the idea. Their daughter, their fiercely independent yet deeply connected daughter, had no reason to run. As police pursued their official investigation, a parallel search fueled by love and desperation was being waged by her family and community. They called upon the public for help. Flyers were quickly designed and printed, her radiant smile looking out from the page, a heartbreaking contrast to the grim text below. Missing under suspicious circumstances, the headline read in bold letters. It listed her description: the tan jacket and black pants she was last seen wearing, the small pink backpack she carried. It detailed her 4 distinctive tattoos: a Virgo symbol behind her left ear, a half-moon sun on the back of her neck, a large Medusa in red ink on her right thigh, and then the number 77 on the inside of her right forearm. It mentioned her small diamond stud nose piercing and described her car: a red 2014 Ford Fiesta with Illinois license plates. Social media exploded with shares and reposts. Charisma's face was everywhere. Her family's desperate pleas for information echoed across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Every share meant new eyes, a new chance. The family and their supporters organized search parties, braving the bitter January cold, to comb through parks, wooded areas, and anywhere a person or car might be hidden. They followed every tip, every whisper of a potential sighting. Their hope flickered like a fragile flame against a storm of fear. The days bled into one another, a relentless cycle of hope and despair. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of agony. Each sunset deepened the darkness. The silence stretched for 5 long days, an eternity of not knowing. While volunteers searched on foot, police focused on the one tangible piece of the puzzle they had: Charisma's car. The red Ford Fiesta became their primary target. Patrol cars tirelessly canvassed neighborhoods, their occupants scanning every street, every alley, every parking lot. They concentrated on large shopping centers and underground garages, places where a car could sit unnoticed for days. But the city was vast and red cars seemed countless. The break in the case came not with a triumphant rescue, but with a devastating discovery. On Friday, January 28th, 5 days after Charisma had driven away from her home, police found the Ford Fiesta. It was parked on the 5900 block of West Iowa Street in the South Austin neighborhood on the city's west side, a quiet residential street lined with other cars, blending in almost perfect. According to the police report, the car had been sitting there since Monday morning. For 4 days, it had gone completely unnoticed. Around 5:30 p.m., as the winter evening cast long shadows across the street, officers approached the vehicle. What they discovered inside extinguished the last embers of hope for Charisma's safe return. In the backseat of her own car, Charisma Arisman was found unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The search was over. A new, more horrifying chapter was just beginning. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an autopsy. On Sunday, the official cause of death was released, confirming the family's worst fears. Charisma Arisman had died of strangulation and smothering. Her death was ruled a homicide. The case was no longer about finding a missing person. It was about hunting a murderer. In the grim aftermath of the discovery, the investigation's focus sharpened dramatically. The primary question was no longer where is Charisma, but who did this to her? The investigators' first priority became retracing her final hours, building a timeline that would lead them to her killer. In today's world, the most detailed diaries of our lives aren't written in ink, but in data. The key to unlocking this mystery, detectives believed, lay hidden in Charisma's cell phone. They requested and received access to her phone records and location data. As investigators sifted through the digital breadcrumbs of her final day, a single name rose from the silence: Richard Chavez. The last call from Charisma's phone had gone to a number registered to the 24-year-old Chavez. Her final text message also sent to him. This was no coincidence. It was a blazing red flag. The investigation into Richard Chavez began immediately. A background check revealed a man who was no stranger to law enforcement. He'd been on police radar multiple times. Court records showed that in 2016, Chavez had pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor count of resisting or obstructing a police officer, earning him a year of court supervision. At the very time of Charisma's disappearance, he was wanted on an outstanding warrant for driving under the influence. Further digging revealed how Charisma and Chavez had crossed paths. They'd met online. The digital world that connects so many people had, in this case, facilitated a fatal encounter. For Charisma's family, this revelation was devastating. Their daughter was smart and cautious. Her father, Jeffrey, insisted she wasn't the type to meet up with a stranger from the internet by herself. "She knows better than that," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "This isn't Charisma. She would never have met up with someone on her own." The family came to believe that someone their daughter knew and trusted must have vouched for Chavez, convincing her this dangerous man was safe. With the digital trail pointing directly to Chavez, detectives tracked down his address in Oak Park. It was time for a visit. Two experienced investigators drove to the location. When they knocked on the door, it opened to reveal a young man whose face showed pure surprise. Richard Chavez hadn't been expecting police at his doorstep. The detectives, trained to read every flicker of emotion, watched as initial shock quickly transformed into forced composure. Chavez seemed to be gathering himself, trying to project an image of calm, unshaken control. The detectives informed him they were there about the disappearance of Charisma Irisman. They had some questions. Chavez didn't deny knowing her. He confirmed they'd met just days before. With a face devoid of emotion, he told the officers that Charisma had come to his home on the night of Sunday, January 23rd. He claimed their meeting had ended in consensual intimacy. According to his version, he went to bed around 8:00 p.m. that night. When he woke the next morning around 10:00 a.m., Charisma was gone. He said he simply assumed she'd gone home. He finished his story and fell silent, eyes fixed on the detectives' faces. But his account had holes, and his appearance told a different tale. The investigators couldn't help but notice several fresh scratches on his hands. They were the kind of marks that could have been left by someone fighting desperately. The scratches cast a dark shadow of doubt over his entire story. His words were calm, but the marks on his skin whispered a violent struggle. The detectives had heard enough. Based on his outstanding Dewey warrant, officers arrested Richard Chavez. He was taken into custody, remaining in jail on that charge, while the investigation swirled around him. He may have thought his story was believable, but the evidence was just beginning to mount. To convict someone of such a serious crime, police need more than suspicion and a weak alibi. They need solid evidence. While Chavez sat in his jail cell, detectives turned their attention to his neighborhood. In today's world, there are eyes everywhere. Doorbell cameras, business surveillance systems, countless digital witnesses that never sleep. Investigators began the careful work of canvassing Chavez's neighbors, requesting any surveillance footage from the night of January 23rd and the morning of January 24th. Here, they discovered something far more valuable than witness testimony. They found several surveillance videos that provided a chilling, silent record of what really happened. Court records would later reveal the timeline captured by these unblinking electronic eyes. At around 10:40 p.m. on Sunday night, a neighbor's surveillance camera recorded Charisma's red Ford Fiesta arriving at Richard Chavez's Oak Park home. The footage showed Chavez greeting her, then captured both of them going inside his residence together. Prosecutors would later reveal a crucial fact from the continued surveillance. Charisma never left that home. The next piece of footage came from the following morning. At approximately 7:30 a.m. on Monday, January 24th, a camera captured Richard Chavez getting into Charisma's red Ford Fiesta and driving away. He was alone. Later that same morning, a separate surveillance camera from a different location told the next chapter of the story. It captured Chavez parking Charisma's car on the 5900 block of West Iowa Street. The video then revealed him stepping out of the vehicle and walking away into the distance. The final piece of this visual puzzle showed Chavez wandering through the South Austin neighborhood for nearly an hour. He seemed lost, drifting aimlessly through the streets in that bitter morning cold. Then, finally, he made a phone call. He reached out to his brother, asking for a pickup less than a mile from where he'd left Charisma's car and her body. This surveillance footage delivered a crushing blow to Chavez' version of events. He'd insisted he simply woke up to find her gone. But the cameras told a different story entirely. They captured him driving her car, abandoning it, then calmly arranging his ride home. He had lied, and the cameras had caught every moment. Combined with cell phone data that placed Charisma's phone at his address the night she vanished, an unshakable timeline emerged, one that pointed to only one possible suspect. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but prosecutors weren't finished building their case. While Chavez sat in jail on that DUI warrant, investigators executed a search warrant at his home on January 31st. What they discovered inside painted an even darker picture. Hair clippings scattered in the garbage, a half-packed suitcase waiting in his bedroom. These were the telltale signs of a man preparing to run. But the most damning evidence of his escape plans came from his own lips. Behind bars, Chavez placed a call to his parents, unaware that authorities were listening to every word. In that conversation, he asked them to prepare his passport. Between the physical evidence from his apartment, the digital trail from cell phone records, the visual proof from surveillance cameras, and now the audio evidence of his own voice, the case against him was sealed tight. On February 2nd, 2022, 24-year-old Richard Chavez was officially charged with 1 count of first-degree murder in Charisma Arizman's death. At his bond hearing, prosecutors unveiled the mountain of evidence they'd carefully assembled. Judge Susana Ortiz listened to the details of the crime and Chavez's calculated cover-up attempts. She ordered him held without bail. She also denied bail for violating his existing DUI bond terms. He would stay locked up, awaiting trial for taking the life of a young woman who had shown him nothing but trust. Later, on February 23, 2023, he faced a new indictment, attempting to conceal a felony. It was a stark reminder of his deliberate efforts to escape justice. For the Arizman family, the arrest and charges brought grim validation, but no relief from their crushing grief. They'd been kept in the dark throughout much of the investigation, often learning new developments through news reports. Now the details of their daughter's final hours lay exposed in the cold, clinical language of court documents and news broadcasts. The pain felt unbearable. Their home, once alive with Charisma's laughter, now echoed with what her grandmother, Kathy Arizman, described as wailing sounds of grief, pain, and loss. At the court hearing, Kathy spoke on behalf of the family. Her words cut straight to the man accused of murdering her granddaughter. A raw and powerful tribute to the beautiful soul stolen from them. "You took the most precious, loving soul you could have ever known," she said, her grief transforming into righteous anger. "I leave this in our Lord Jesus' hands. Who are you to take another one's life in your hands and murder them? What man takes a beautiful young woman's life? We can't have Charisma back in our lives." The legal proceedings against Richard Chavez crawl forward at the slow, grinding pace of the justice system. While the Arizman family waits for trial, for that final verdict, they're left to navigate a world permanently dimmed without Charisma's light. They've been forced into a club no one ever wants to join, the families of murder victims. Their lives are now split into a before and an after. Story 5. The night of March 2nd, 2018, settled over the affluent suburbs of Austin, Texas, like a blanket of deceptive calm. In their sprawling home on Oliver Drive, a residence that whispered of success and dreams fulfilled, Ted and Corey Shaughnessy were winding down for the evening. This house was their fortress, a testament to decades of hard work building Dream Gallery Jewelers into a cornerstone of the Austin community. Ted, 55 was the heart of their business, a man whose easy charm and genuine passion for his craft had transformed customers into lifelong friends. Corey was the expert, a certified gemologist whose sharp eye and business savvy perfectly balanced Ted's warm personality. Together, they were unstoppable, not just in business, but in a marriage that had weathered decades, a true partnership built on love and unwavering respect. Their home, filled with the warmth of their shared life and the comforting presence of their two Rottweilers, was their sanctuary. But in the deepest hours of that Friday night, their sanctuary was about to be shattered. The first sound to pierce the stillness was frenzied barking, an urgent, primal warning that something was terribly wrong. Ted and Corey jolted awake, hearts instantly hammering with cold, adrenaline-fueled dread. The sound wasn't distant. It was inside their house. Intruders. The word hung unspoken between them. For a household of jewelers, this was the nightmare that had always lurked in the shadows of their prosperous life. Instinct took over. Ted, ever the protector, grabbed the .45 caliber handgun he kept for exactly this possibility. He moved from the bedroom into the hallway, a shadow advancing toward the chaos. Corey followed close behind, clutching her own .357 revolver, hands trembling but resolve hardening with each step. .OL. The peaceful quiet of their home had transformed into something terrifying. The air grew thick with the certainty of violence. Then the world exploded. A hail of gunfire erupted in the hallway, deafening cracks of multiple weapons echoing through their home. Corey watched Ted fall. In that horrifying, suspended moment, her world shattered completely. The man she had loved for most of her life was gone, cut down in a storm of bullets. Now the intruders were turning toward her. A wave of primal survival instinct crashed over Corey's grief and terror. She raised her revolver and fired back, squeezing the trigger again and again, the brutal shock of recoil against her hands. She emptied the cylinder. 6 shots fired into the darkness toward the flashes of her attackers' muzzles. She didn't know if she hit anyone. She didn't wait to find out. As the intruders momentarily fell back, she scrambled into a closet and pulled the door shut. Her fingers, slick with sweat and shaking uncontrollably, fumbled for her phone. Huddled in the darkness, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling her nostrils, she dialed 911. Her voice came out as a ragged whisper, a desperate plea for help cutting through the sudden, ringing silence. The operator struggled to understand her, but the message was crystal clear. There had been a shooting. The address she gave was in one of Travis County's most exclusive neighborhoods. Police were on their way. As she waited in the suffocating confines of the closet, every creak of the house, every distant siren sent fresh spikes of terror through her. She didn't know if the men were still inside. She didn't know if they'd come back for her. All she knew was that Ted was lying in that hallway, and the life she'd known just minutes before was over forever. The battle for Oliver Drive had ended, leaving behind a battlefield of broken glass, bullet-riddled walls, and a silence more terrible than any sound. When the first Travis County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found a scene of absolute carnage. The home that should have been a testament to order and prosperity looked like a war zone. Bullet casings of 2 different calibers, 40 and now 380, littered the floor, indicating at least 2 shooters. Ted Shaughnessy lay near the kitchen, his life taken by multiple gunshot wounds. One of the family's beloved Rottweilers, Bart, lay nearby. Another casualty of the senseless violence. Detectives Paul Salo and James Moore surveyed the chaos, their initial assessment leaning toward a robbery gone horribly wrong. The victims were well-known jewelers. The motive seemed obvious. Someone had targeted the house, expecting a safe full of gems and cash. But as they began processing the scene, that neat theory started to unravel. The first inconsistency was the point of entry. A single ground floor window on the side of the house had been left wide open, the screen neatly removed and set outside. It was too clean, too specific for a random burglary. More telling still, that window led to a bedroom that detectives soon learned belonged to the Shaughnessy's only son, Nicholas, who was away at college. It was his old room. Then came the second anomaly. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The house was a mess from the gunfight, but there were no signs of ransacking. The safe sat untouched. Valuables lay scattered in plain sight. This wasn't a robbery. This was an assassination. Assistant District Attorney Amy Meredith, called to the scene to help preserve evidence, reached the same chilling conclusion. The house was too large, the layout too complex for strangers to navigate in the dark. This was not a stranger killing, she would later state. Everything pointed to an inside job. Corey, hysterical but physically unharmed, was being tended to by first responders. Through her grief and shock, she provided what information she could. She had no idea who the attackers were. She hadn't seen their faces. Her mind, like the detectives, immediately went to their business. Being a jeweler, you might someday be a target, she reasoned. The devastating task of delivering the news fell to Corey. She called her 19-year-old son, Nick, who was living 2 hours away in College Station with his girlfriend, Jackie Edison. He and Jackie immediately began the drive to Austin, arriving around 8:00 a.m. to a house cordoned off with yellow tape, swarming with law enforcement. Detective Saleo met the young man. Nick comes over and he's emotional, Saleo recalled. The detective explained what had happened. Intruders had entered the home and shot his father to death. Nick's response struck the seasoned detective as peculiar. It wasn't a cry of anguish or a demand for details about the killers. His first question was, did he suffer? It was an odd, detached inquiry, a question more suited to a clinician than a grieving son. The strangeness continued. As the morning wore on, Nick and Jackie seemed less interested in comforting Corey or speaking with detectives, and more interested in the news crews that had gathered at the edge of the crime scene. They repeatedly tried to talk to reporters, forcing officers to ask them to stay back. Then Nick did something that sent a jolt of suspicion through the investigative team. He walked directly to the side of the house and began examining the open window, the entry point into his old bedroom. For him to know that that was even involved, he did not have that information, Detective Moore noted. How does he know the entry point unless he was involved in creating the entry point? The red flags were beginning to multiply. All 3 surviving family members, Corey, Nick, and Jackie, agreed to go to the station for questioning and allowed police to search their phones. On Nick's phone, they found something critical, an app that controlled his parents' home security system. Corey had told them the system was off and unarmed, and had been switched off the night of the murder, but the alarm's history log told a different story. At 4:27 a.m., just before the shooting, there was an activation for an open window, then a series of glass break activations. That's when Ted died, Ada Meredith concluded. That's when the shots were being fired. Someone had remotely disarmed the system. The log showed the deactivation had come from Nick's phone. When officers prepared to perform a gunshot residue test on Nick and Jackie, the suspicion solidified. As soon as she was separated from Nick, Jackie broke down, becoming hysterical. That was a major red flag for me, Detective Moore said. We knew there was something more to this at that point. The loving son and his girlfriend, who had rushed to the side of their devastated mother, were now the primary suspects in a carefully orchestrated plot. In the weeks that followed the murder, Corey Shaughnessy existed in a fog of grief, trauma, and a mounting sense of persecution. While she was burying her husband, she was also being treated as a suspect by the Travis County Sheriff's Office. They questioned her repeatedly, probing the state of her marriage, her finances, and her actions on the night of the attack. When she tried to access Ted's $1 million life insurance policy to keep their business afloat, the process was stalled. I was the only beneficiary, she said. That could only mean that they suspected me. The insinuation was poison. twisting her victimhood into a source of suspicion. Her anger at the investigators grew, a hard shell forming around her shattered heart. What she couldn't fathom, what her mind refused to accept, was that the detective's suspicions were shifting away from her and toward the two people she was now clinging to for support: her son, Nick, and his girlfriend, Jackie. In a move that seemed natural for a grieving family, Nick and Jackie had moved back into the Oliver Drive home with Corey. The house, a place of unimaginable horror, was now also the backdrop for a chilling charade. Corey, desperate for a semblance of normalcy, began helping the young couple plan a proper wedding ceremony. They had revealed to her after the murder that they had secretly married months earlier, a fact they had hidden from Ted and her. Corey, determined to be a good mother, insisted they do things properly. So there she was, busying herself with guest lists and invitations while the man of the house lay cold in the morgue. What she didn't know was chilling. Corey was living with the very architects of her husband's murder. The investigators knew it, or at least they suspected it with mounting certainty, but they couldn't tell her. That's a hard line to walk, Detective Moore admitted later. The fear for her safety hung heavy in the air. When you have two people who may have planned her husband's killing now living under the same roof, of course you're worried about Corey's safety. While Corey planned a wedding, detectives were carefully unwinding a thread of digital and financial clues that led directly back to Nick and Jackie. Phone records proved Nick had lied when he claimed he hadn't been in Austin for a month before the murder. He'd actually been in town just 2 days prior, likely for a final planning session. Then came the text messages. In the days leading up to the killing, Nick had texted that he was working on it. Jackie's chilling reply came back. Did they want $50K or not? We can't afford to pay half before. They had also withdrawn $1,000 in cash, money authorities believed was a down payment for the hit. The motive was becoming grimly clear. A high school friend of Nick's, Spencer Patterson, the same friend who had officiated their secret wedding, became a key witness. He told police that Nick had been talking about coming into a massive inheritance once his parents were gone. The figure he mentioned was $8 million, combining the $2 million life insurance policy with the value of the house and gallery jewelry. Nick had literally put a price tag on his parents' lives. Patterson's testimony grew even more horrifying. He showed detectives text messages where Nick had actually tried to hire him to carry out the murders. Just walk in and shoot a family, Nick had written with bone-chilling nonchalance. Steal all there. No mask needed 'cause they'll all be dead. Patterson had refused. On May 29, 2018, nearly 3 months after the murder, police had enough evidence. They arrested Nick Shaughnessy and Jacqueline Edison for criminal solicitation of capital murder. For Corey, the news hit like an incomprehensible blow. I'm still under the assumption that he's being wrongly accused, she said later, describing her complete state of denial. She hired the best defense attorney she could find for her son, convinced that the police, having been wrong about her, were now framing him. The idea that her boy, the 16-month-old orphan she had adopted from Ukraine and showered with love and animal crackers, could be a monster, it was a reality she wasn't ready to face. You could have told me aliens landed on the front yard, she said. And I would have believed that before I would have believed that Nicholas and Jackie planned to have us killed. But as the arrest affidavits were unsealed and the evidence became public, the texts, the financial motive, the alarm logs, her rock-solid belief began to crumble. The foundation of her world, already fractured by Ted's death, was disintegrating into dust. I got to where I understood that yes, they were involved in some way, she confessed. Even then, her mother's heart sought a less monstrous explanation. Maybe he owed someone money. Maybe it was a drug deal gone wrong. Anything was better than the truth. With Nick and Jackie in custody but refusing to name the shooters, the investigation hit a wall. Months passed. In early July, a frustrated detective Moore decided to re-examine the security footage from the porch of Nick and Jackie's College Station apartment. Poring over the video from 2 days before the murder, he spotted two men arriving at their door. He froze the frame. One of the men was wearing a green t-shirt with a company logo. Anderson, a window company. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Detective Moore drove to the company, where their desperate investigation met a stroke of incredible luck. An employee's daughter recognized the man in the photo. He had worked there briefly years before, but she still remembered his name. Cameron Vosmek. When detectives went to Vosmek's home, his wife answered the door. "I know why you're here," she said, stunning the officers. She told them that a man named Johnny Leon had recently approached her husband, offering him money to kill some jewelry store parents. Vosmek had turned him down. Johnny Leon, police realized, was the other man in the security footage from Nick's porch. They brought him in for questioning. Leon admitted that Nick had tried to hire him, but denied being the killer. "I'm not going to lie to you," he told detectives. "When someone offers you $100K, you're going to think about it." Police didn't believe his denial and arrested him for capital murder. On Leon's phone, they found their final link, a flurry of communication around the time of the murder with a man from Fort Worth named Aaron Smith. Smith was brought in. He confessed, breaking down completely in the interrogation room. He admitted to being at the Shaughnessy home and to being the one who fired the fatal shot that killed Ted. Overcome with a torrent of emotion that stood in stark contrast to Nick's cold detachment, he told detectives he couldn't sleep at night. Then he made a shocking request that left everyone stunned. "I killed somebody. I deserve to die," he sobbed, his voice breaking with each word. "I request the death penalty." Finally, he revealed where they could find the murder weapon. It was the .40 caliber pistol that had mysteriously disappeared from the gun box in Nick's old bedroom. The gun that killed Ted Shaughnessy was Ted's own gun, taken from his home, handed to a hitman by his son, and used to end his life in his own hallway. For Corey, this was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Her denial crumbled completely, crushed by the full, horrific weight of the truth. Her son had orchestrated this entire nightmare. The legal proceedings revealed the truly diabolical nature of the plot, but the justice they delivered left Corey Shaughnessy feeling more victimized than ever. With confessions and evidence mounting against them, the case seemed headed straight for a capital murder trial, where the death penalty loomed as a real possibility. Aaron Smith, the shooter, had already asked for it himself. But justice has a way of taking unexpected turns. By spring 2021, the prosecutorial landscape in Travis County had shifted. A new district attorney, Jose Garza, was now in office, and his administration made an offer to the three men charged with capital murder, plead guilty to a reduced charge of murder, and in exchange, receive a sentence of 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole, avoiding a potential death sentence entirely. Johnny, Leon, and Aaron Smith all accepted the deal. Corey, facing the unbearable reality of her son's guilt, wrote him a letter begging him to do the same. Nicholas Shaughnessy accepted. With his plea, he would be eligible for release as early as age 36. The most shocking deal, however, was saved for Jacqueline Edison. Just 2 weeks after her arrest, Jackie had started cooperating with investigators, pointing the finger directly at Nick as the mastermind. She claimed he was drowning in financial trouble, and that she was merely an unwilling participant who had tried to stop him. A claim investigators found no evidence to support. Based on her cooperation, she was released on reduced bond. Years later, the Garza's office offered her an almost unbelievable plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to conspiracy to attempt to commit capital murder, she would serve just 120 days in county jail, followed by 10 years of probation. Corey was absolutely stunned. "It's astounding. It's absolutely astounding," she said. "It is an outright dismissal of everything that I went through as a victim, and it's a dismissal of Ted's life. The woman who she believed had helped plan her elimination who had lived in her home and shared her meals while plotting to get her hands on an inheritance, would walk free after just 4 months. When prosecutors asked Corey to appear at Jackie's plea hearing in June 23, she refused. Instead, she recorded a video statement from home. A blistering message that was played in the courtroom. Staring directly into the camera, she addressed her daughter-in-law without mercy. "I'm alive because your plan to have me taken out didn't succeed. You are a monster. You are evil, and everyone needs to know it. You knew what was about to happen, and yet you sat home and did nothing because you wanted it to happen." Monsieur. For Corey, the betrayal was complete. The boy she had loved, the one who adored fast cars and wore his father's racing helmet, was gone, replaced by a stranger she could no longer recognize. "Nicholas and Jackie destroyed my entire world," she stated, her words heavy with the finality of her loss. "They took my husband. They took memories. They took my business. They took everything I had that I cared about." She has since moved out of state and lives under a new name, a shadow of her former life. She saw a video of her son's apology from prison. "It means nothing to me," she said, her voice completely flat. "In my mind, I am supposed to be gone. And so I'm a ghost, and ghosts can't speak." The love for her son still exists, but it is a love for a memory, for the boy he once was. The man he became is someone she doesn't know. Her life, spared by her own fierce will to survive, continues. But it is a life forever marked by the night the monsters came, and the horrifying discovery that they had been living inside her own home all along. Story 6. The air on Center Hill Lake in July buzzed with that electric thrill of summer. It was 2015, and Wakest was in full swing. The annual wakeboarding tournament wasn't really a formal competition. It was more like a sprawling, chaotic celebration of youth, sun, and that intoxicating freedom that comes with being young and alive on a scorching Tennessee weekend. Boats carved through the shimmering water, their wakes creating fleeting patterns that vanished as quickly as they formed. The shoreline pulsed with music and laughter, 1,000 conversations blending into one vibrant roar. For 21-year-old Lauren A.G., this was exactly where she wanted to be. Lauren was pure energy in human form, a young woman whose smile could light up any room, whose spirit practically sparkled with life. A criminal science major from Hendersonville, she had this rare combination of sharp intellect and genuine compassion that drew people to her like a magnet. She was the kind of person who made friends effortlessly, who saw the good in everyone and believed wholeheartedly in the promise of each new day. That weekend, the promise was adventure and memories with her best friend, Hannah Palmer. The plan was beautifully simple, a weekend of camping, music, and pure fun with Hannah, Hannah's boyfriend Aaron Lilly, and Aaron's friend Chris Stout, someone Lauren had just met. They were 4 young souls bursting with excitement, ready to dive headfirst into the festival's whirlwind. Their chosen campsite was both stunning and dangerous, a remote stretch of land you could only reach by boat. It was rugged paradise, a finger of rock and trees jutting into the lake, offering breathtaking views and blessed isolation from the main festival crowds. On one side, the cliff plunged a staggering 90 feet to the water below. On the other, a less severe, but still treacherous 35-foot drop. It was a place of heart-stopping beauty and hidden peril, a duality that would soon define the weekend's tragic turn. As the sun began sinking below the horizon on Saturday, July 25th, casting long shadows across the water, the festival's energy hit fever pitch. The group made their way to a bar, diving into the sea of partygoers. The air hung thick with the smell of beer and lake water, alive with music and joyous shouts. Lauren, radiant and happy, melted seamlessly into the scene. An off-duty police officer working security that night, Chris Yick, would later remember seeing her there, a bright, smiling face in the crowd. He watched as Lauren and her 3 friends left the bar together around 2:00 a.m. and a small group disappearing into the vast darkness of the dock. Their silhouettes flickered for just a moment against the distant marina lights. Then they were gone. They took a boat back to their secluded campsite. The gentle lapping of waves against the hull, a soft rhythm beneath the fading pulse of festival music. Back on the cliffside, their world shrank to the small circle of their camp. The night was warm. The sky, a blanket of stars. According to the story her friends would later tell police, all four were intoxicated as they settled in for the night. Hannah and Aaron retreated to their tent, while Lauren and Chris Stout decided to sleep in a hammock strung between two trees, dangerously close to the cliff's edge. The gentle sway of the hammock, the soft summer breeze, the distant echo of the party. These were the last peaceful moments Lauren Egg would ever know. The next morning, the sun rose on quiet confusion. Hannah Palmer awoke, and, according to her statement, found the hammock empty except for Chris Stout. "Where's Lauren?" she asked him. Stout's reply was unnervingly casual. "She got up a while ago, but I didn't feel her," he said, adding that he had no idea how long she'd been gone. You'd expect a flicker of worry, immediate alarm. But what followed was strange and unsettling calm. Lauren's flip-flops were still at the campsite. Her purse and cell phone, that essential lifeline to the modern world, lay completely untouched. She had vanished into the night, leaving everything behind. Yet no one called for help. No one raised the alarm. The justification her friends later gave was that Lauren was so outgoing, the kind of person who befriends anyone. They decided she must have wandered off, maybe met someone new and gone with them. "We thought maybe someone came and got her," Stout would tell police. So they waited. They went down to the boat dock and waited as minutes stretched into hours, as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze. While they waited, a local man named Lynn Blair and his son Dylan were out on the lake, enjoying a quiet Sunday of fishing. They navigated their boat into a peaceful cove near the cliffs, the very cliffs where Lauren and her friends had made camp. As they drifted closer, a flash of color in the water caught Lynn's eye. It was bright, almost fluorescent pink. As the boat drew closer, the shape in the water began to take form, first appearing as a pair of shorts, then with a heart-stopping moment of recognition, revealing itself as a human body floating face down in the lake. It was terrifying, Blair would later recall. The horror of that moment burned forever into his memory. "We knew it was a young lady." The discovery shattered the festival's carefree atmosphere in an instant. Word spread like wildfire through the crowd, quickly reaching the authorities. For Lauren's parents, Sherry and Michael Smith, their worst nightmare began with a simple knock at the door. A police officer stood on their porch, his face grave, explaining there had been an accident. They needed to get to the hospital immediately. The drive became a haze of terror and confusion. At the hospital, another officer delivered the devastating news that would split their world in half. Lauren was gone. Through the overwhelming storm of grief, Sherry Smith's first clear thought came as a desperate question. "The first thing out of my mouth that I said to him was, 'Where are the people that she was with?'" she remembered. The officer's response was brief and direct. "We're questioning them." The investigation by the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department moved quickly, and in many people's eyes was shockingly shallow. The official story came together fast. Lauren Egg, with a blood alcohol level more than twice the legal limit, had tragically lost her footing in the darkness, fallen from the cliff, struck the rocks below, and tumbled into the lake. The medical examiner declared her death an accident, caused by blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. The case appeared closed before it had truly begun. But for Sherry Smith, this explanation rang hollow. A poor fit for the vibrant life her daughter had lived. Her mother's instinct screamed that something wasn't right. The pieces simply didn't come together. The story Lauren's friends were telling felt rehearsed, lacking the raw panic and genuine grief she would have expected. Her suspicions solidified when she discovered a photo on Chris Stout's Instagram account, posted just one day after her daughter's body was pulled from the lake. The image showed Hannah Palmer and Aaron Lilly smiling together on a boat. The original caption, a chilling glimpse into their mindset, read simply, "Best weekend ever." It was later changed to something less jarring, but the damage was already done. How could they possibly be having the best weekend ever when their friend lay dead? These doubts began to fester, growing into an unshakable belief that Lauren's death was no accident. Sherry started pushing for answers, asking hard questions, but met only a wall of official indifference. Frustrated and heartbroken, she found herself adrift, a mother lost in an ocean of unanswered questions, her daughter's memory overshadowed by a story she simply couldn't accept. Her search for the truth was just beginning, a lonely, difficult journey she was determined to see through to the very end. "I'm never going to give up until I find the truth," she promised, a vow made to her child's memory. "My baby was worth it. I'm never going to give up. Ever." The turning point in Sherry Smith's solitary fight came through an unexpected phone call. On the other end was Ryan Melanson, a police officer from a neighboring area who had been at Center Hill Lake during Wakefest. He'd been on scene after Lauren's body was discovered and had spent time with Aaron Lilly and Chris Stout. What he shared with Sherry confirmed her deepest fears. "I didn't believe it was an accident," he stated plainly. "Their behavior, no remorse," Melanson explained, describing the young men's demeanor. They weren't saddened by losing their friend. They were scared. They had all the wrong body language. Another officer who was there, Chris Yarchuk, felt the same way. He remembered seeing the two men in a canoe as authorities moved toward the spot where Lauren's body was found. "I saw the two boys in a canoe hanging onto a houseboat, just waiting, directly looking at where the body was," Yarchuk recalled. When the officers came back, the men started shouting, "Our friend is missing! Our friend's missing!" To Yarchuk, it felt completely staged. This confirmation from law enforcement was exactly what Sherry needed to hear. Realizing she couldn't count on the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department, she decided to take control of the situation herself. In February 2016, she hired Sheila Wysocki, a private investigator with an extraordinary and deeply personal story. Years before, Wysocki had been a stay-at-home mom who, driven by her own quest for justice, helped solve the cold case of her college roommate's murder. Now she devoted her life to helping other families navigate the maze of mysterious deaths and failed investigations. In Sheila Wysocki, Sherry Smith found more than just an investigator. She found a relentless and caring ally. Wysocki launched her investigation by tearing apart the official story, piece by piece. She began with the scene itself, the cliff. The official report described a simple, tragic fall. But when Wysocki's team examined the location closely, they discovered something that completely contradicted this theory. The cliff wasn't a sheer, vertical drop at all. Instead, it sloped downward, thick with trees and bushes, even marked with clear pathways. For Lauren to have tumbled from that hammock and somehow ended up in the water below, her body would have had to completely defy the laws of physics, somehow sailing clear over all that dense vegetation and rocky terrain between the campsite and the lake's edge. "Police say she fell off the cliff," Wakey challenged. "But exactly where did she fall? Show me the pictures of blood on the rocks. Show me the broken twigs." There were none. The entire scene was missing any physical evidence of the violent fall that authorities insisted had happened. Next, Wysocki turned her focus to the autopsy report and its accompanying photographs. While the medical examiner had concluded Lauren's injuries matched a fall, Wysocki and her team of independent experts saw something far more sinister. There, on one of Lauren's breasts, was a mark that Wysocki believed came from human teeth. She also spotted what looked like clear signs of strangulation. A forensic pathologist reviewed the same photos and disagreed, stating the evidence strongly supported a fall from a cliff. He wasn't convinced the mark was a bite at all. But for Wysocki and the Smith family, even the possibility was too disturbing to dismiss. The investigation then shifted to the people who'd been with Lauren that final night. Vaisakhi managed to secure a sit-down interview with Hannah Palmer. During the conversation, as Palmer shared her version of events, her phone suddenly rang. It was Aaron Lilly. Wakey and her team couldn't help but overhear his chillingly clear instruction to Palmer. Stick to the story. It was a moment of pure, undiluted suspicion. A simple sentence that seemed to expose a carefully crafted lie. The cloud of suspicion around Aaron Lilly grew even darker when Vaisakhi tracked down his ex-girlfriend, Cassie Franks. Franks painted a terrifying portrait of Lilly as a man with a violent history. She told Vaisakhi he'd been physically abusive toward her, and she had proof. She showed Vaisakhi photographs of her injuries, bruises, marks around her neck, and most disturbingly, bite marks. The similarity to the mark found on Lauren's body was impossible to ignore. Franks shared how she'd tried to bring this information to the Deco County investigator early in the case. I told him everything I knew, start to finish. I even explained that Aaron had a violent past. That's why we broke up. According to Franks, the investigator's response was shockingly dismissive. He said that has nothing to do with it. There's no violence in this matter. It was an accident, and we're trying to prove it was an accident. Even worse, Franks claimed the investigator ended their meeting with what felt like a veiled threat, warning her not to speak with any private investigators. If you talk to anybody else, he allegedly told her, I can't protect you. Perhaps the most damning evidence Vaisakhi's investigation uncovered came from a new witness named Chris Brown, a father and small business owner who'd been staying at the lake with his family that same weekend. Brown stepped forward after seeing news reports about the case. He stated that around midnight on the night Lauren disappeared, he witnessed a young white male swimming toward the marina dock from the direction of the bluff where the campsite sat. The young man appeared extremely distraught and worn out, Brown said in his statement. He was spitting up water for several minutes. He told us he'd almost drowned swimming from the bluff area to the marina dock. When Brown was later shown a photograph of Aaron Lilly, his identification was certain. I'm sure that Lilly is the young man who came up out of the water that night, he confirmed. This testimony directly contradicted Lilly's own statement to police, that everyone had returned to the campsite and gone to bed by midnight. Brown had actually reported what he'd seen to the Deco County Sheriff's Office at the time, but was told they'd contact him if it became relevant. They never called him back. As Vaisakhi dug deeper, the sloppiness of the official investigation became glaringly obvious. The 911 calls made the day Lauren's body was discovered had inexplicably vanished. When Sherry Smith asked for her daughter's belongings, the sheriff's office claimed they didn't have them. The sleeping bags, clothes, and other items Lauren had brought with her, all gone. It was a cascade of failures, a pattern of negligence that seemed to go far beyond simple incompetence. To the Smith family, it felt like a deliberate effort to bury the truth along with their daughter. Armed with this mountain of new evidence and glaring inconsistencies, Sherry Smith took the fight to the next level. In December 2016, she and her husband Michael filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Hannah Palmer, Aaron Lilly, and Chris Stout-Doctor. The legal process would force all three friends into depositions, where they'd have to answer questions under oath. The Smith family hoped that when faced with the real threat of perjury charges, the truth would finally surface. The deposition room felt heavy with unspoken secrets. One by one, the three people who had been with Lauren during her final hours faced questioning about that fateful weekend. But the moment everyone hoped for, when truth would finally break through, never arrived. Instead, with almost every question posed to them, Hannah, Aaron, and Chris did the same thing. They invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The very legal protection meant to shield innocent people from having to testify against themselves had become a wall, blocking a grieving mother's desperate search for answers. Then came March 2017, and with it, a devastating legal blow. A judge made a ruling that shattered the Smith family's hopes. There wasn't enough evidence for the wrongful death case against Hannah Palmer to move forward. The suit against her was dismissed. Though the civil cases against Lillian Stout could continue, this dismissal hit the Smith family like a punch to the gut. Palmer issued a public statement afterward, expressing her deep sadness and her sincere hope that Lauren's family would somehow find the peace and closure they so desperately needed. But for Cher Smith, peace felt impossible without truth. And closure? That seemed like nothing more than a distant dream. The case went cold. The DeKalb County Sheriff's Department held firm to their original conclusion, stating plainly, "There is simply no evidence in this tragic case that will support Lauren's death being considered a homicide or foul play." Even the FBI, after taking a brief look, closed their file. When Cher Smith tried to use a Freedom of Information Act request to get her hands on the FBI's files, she ran straight into a bureaucratic nightmare. The agency delivered crushing news. It would take 79 months, nearly 7 years, and cost $500 before she could see the files about her own daughter's death. The story of Lauren Agg remains a painful mystery that refuses to be solved. It's become a tale of two completely different narratives. The first is simple and tragic. A young woman who had too much to drink and fell from a cliff in the darkness. A terrible accident. Nothing more. The second narrative is far more chilling. A potential crime followed by a cover-up and a complete breakdown of the justice system. It's a story filled with friends whose behavior suggests guilty consciences, an investigation that seemed flawed from the very beginning, and a mother whose love knows no bounds. A mother who refuses to let her daughter's memory be reduced to a convenient but deeply questionable official explanation. The waters of Center Hill Lake guard their secrets well. And for Lauren's family, the search for what really happened that night goes on and on. It hangs over their lives like a constant, aching question mark that just won't go away. Story 7. The night air in Ogden, Utah, hung heavy with October's early chill, the kind that seeps deep into your bones and whispers of changes yet to come. Street lights flickered along Jackson Avenue, casting long shadows over modest homes where families carved out ordinary lives amid the quiet hum of a city that rarely made headlines for violence. But on that fateful Saturday morning, October 18th, 2025, the peace shattered like fragile glass. Gunshots echoed through the darkness near 3600 Jackson Avenue, where 15-year-old Chanel Alvarez lay sleeping in her bedroom. Her dreams were likely filled with simple teenage joys, school friends, summer camps, the tentative excitement of first love. Chanel was the kind of girl who brightened rooms without even trying. Her smile, wide and genuine, drew people in, making them feel seen in a world that often overlooked the young. At Ben Lomond High School, she navigated the awkward rhythms of teenage life with boundless curiosity. Friends remembered her as compassionate, always ready with a kind word or helping hand. Her laughter was a melody that cut through crowded hallways. But beneath that vibrant exterior, Chanel carried the weight of a family held together by pure resilience. Her mother worked long hours to keep a roof over their heads. Siblings and extended family wove a safety net of love in a neighborhood where stability was hard-won. Around 1:0 a.m., the doorbell rang, a soft intrusion into the house's stillness. Chanel's mother, weary from her shift, answered to find Hezekiah Plummer standing on the porch. At 16, Hezekiah was tall and lanky, his features sharp with adolescent angularity, his eyes shadowed by something indefinable, perhaps the restlessness of a boy who felt the world closing in too soon. He lived in Clearfield, a short drive away, but his home life was a tangle of absences and arguments, the kind that pushed teens like him to seek refuge elsewhere. "I got nowhere to stay," he said, his voice low, carrying the plea of someone used to being turned away. "Chanel, overhearing from her room, vouched for him. "It's okay, Mom," she murmured, her trust in him unwavering. They'd been dating for months, their relationship a mix of youthful passion and teenage uncertainty. Hezekiah had spent considerable time at the Alvarez home before, crashing on the couch or sharing quiet moments with Chanel. Her mother, seeing no immediate harm, relented and let him in. The door clicked shut behind him like a seal on an unspoken promise of safety. The house settled back into quiet, floorboard creaks fading as everyone returned to their beds. A witness in the home, perhaps a family member or close relative staying over, drifted into sleep, unaware of the storm brewing upstairs. Hezekiah made his way to Chanel's room, the door closing softly behind them. What passed between them in those private hours remained shrouded in mystery, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Hezekiah was known to run away from his own family, carrying burdens that showed up as small rebellions, skipping school, hanging with the wrong crowd, dipping into petty troubles that escalated in a town where opportunities felt scarce. Chanel, ever the optimist, might have tried pulling him back, her words gentle but firm, urging him toward better choices. But words can only do so much when emotions run hot and unchecked. Sometime after 2:30 a.m., the first sounds pierced the night. Gunshots, distant at first, popping like firecrackers in faraway streets. They jolted the witness awake, heart pounding as he lay still, listening. Ogden wasn't immune to stray bullets or late-night disturbances, but something about the rhythm felt off, erratic. Then, closer now, a single shot rang out, sharp and intimate, as if whispered right against the house walls. Panic surged through him. He bolted from bed, feet hitting cold floor, racing toward the stairs to check on everyone. Up the staircase he climbed, breath ragged, only to collide with Hezekiah descending in a blur of motion. The boy's face was flushed, eyes wild with fear that masked deeper turmoil. In his hand, glinting under dim hallway light, was a gun, a Glock, sleek and deadly. "Someone tried to rob us," Hezekiah gasped, words tumbling out in a rush, pointing blame outward like a shield. He named another boy, a shadowy neighborhood figure, as if conjuring an intruder could rewrite the horror unfolding. Before the witness could process this, Hezekiah shoved past, bolting down the stairs and out the front door into the enveloping night. The screen door slammed like a final accusation. The witness's legs carried him to Chanel's room, the air thick with gunpowder's metallic tang. There she lay, her body still on the bed, a single wound to her head marking the end of everything. The shot had come from close range, stealing her breath and her future in one incomprehensible moment. Blood pooled slowly, a silent witness to the violence that had shattered their home. Trembling, someone fumbled for a phone, dialing 911, with fingers that wouldn't stay steady. "There's been a shooting," the voice choked out to the dispatcher, each word feeling impossible to say. She's not moving." Sirens wailed in response, cutting through the pre-dawn quiet as Ogden Police Department officers rushed to the scene just before 3:00 a.m. The street, usually peaceful at this hour, now pulsed with flashing lights. Neighbors peered from windows, their faces marked with shock. Officers secured the area, their boots crunching on gravel as they entered the home. The air inside felt heavy, thick with grief and urgency. They confirmed Chanel's death on site. The wound was too severe. Life had already slipped away. Her mother, pulled from sleep by the commotion, stumbled into the chaos. Her world crumbled as paramedics delivered the unthinkable news. "No," she whispered, collapsing against the wall, her sobs raw and endless. She had just seen her daughter alive hours before, vibrant and full of promise. As first responders worked, detectives began piecing together the fragments. The mother's account painted a timeline. Hezekiah's arrival at 10 a.m., M. His search for a backpack in her room, odd and insistent, before retreating to Chanel's space. Now that Glock she had purchased weeks earlier was gone, its empty box discarded in the bedroom like a cruel clue. A single bullet casing lay in the hallway outside the door, gleaming under the forensic lights. Outside, the scene grew more puzzling. What appeared to be bullet holes marked the exterior walls, and 7 shell casings littered the street a significant distance away, as if a confrontation had erupted in the shadows. But the angles didn't match. Those distant shots couldn't have reached Chanel where she lay. Investigators focused their attention. The bedroom held only traces of her and Hezekiah. No signs of forced entry, no struggle beyond the intimate betrayal of violence at close quarters. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community, whispers turning to murmurs of disbelief. Chanel wasn't just a name. She was a fixture at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church, where Pastor Jeff Stevenson had watched her grow over summers at camp. He remembered her vividly. Her infectious smile, the way she'd connect with younger kids, her boundless curiosity lighting up group discussions. She was spectacular, he later told reporters, his voice breaking with the weight of loss. Always caring, compassionate. This is devastating, something no family should endure. The church, a beacon for youth like Chanel who sought structure amid chaos, now grappled with the void her absence left. A GoFundMe appeared almost immediately, strangers and friends alike contributing to ease the burial costs. Each donation became a thread in the tapestry of communal mourning. Meanwhile, Hezekiah had vanished into the night, his flight a desperate bid to outrun the consequences. Police issued alerts describing him as a runaway with a history of evading authority. Hours ticked by, the sun rising over the Wasatch Mountains, bathing Ogden in light that felt mocking in its normalcy. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewing neighbors who recalled hearing the shots but seeing little. Hezekiah's own family, fractured and distant, offered few leads. He had a pattern of disappearing, couch surfing with friends or fading into the fringes. But Ogden's law enforcement knew the terrain. The back roads to Davis County, the hidden spots where teens like him sought refuge. By midday, a tip led them to Clearfield, just north of Ogden, where Hezekiah was spotted moving through a quiet neighborhood. Officers moved in swiftly, their unmarked car blocking his path. He didn't resist, his shoulders slumping as handcuffs clicked into place. A search revealed telling evidence. Several ounces of marijuana tucked into his pockets, along with $4,080 in cash. Sums that raised questions about his activities beyond the shooting. No gun, though. Prosecutors would later allege he had disposed of it, a calculated act to sever the link between his hands and the crime. Booked into juvenile detention initially, the gravity of the charges loomed large. This wasn't petty theft or truancy. It was murder, intimate and domestic, the kind that tore at the fabric of young lives. News of the arrest rippled through the Alvarez home, where grief had taken root like a stubborn weed. Chanel's mother sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where her daughter used to chat about school, her hands clutching a photo from last summer's camp. The image showed Chanel laughing, her hair catching the sunlight, oblivious to the shadows that lay ahead. Her siblings huddled together nearby, their questions hanging in the air without answers. The house felt unnaturally vast and empty without her warm presence filling its rooms. Friends gathered outside on the doorstep, gently placing flowers while their tears fell onto the delicate petals. They shared tender stories of Chanel's endless kindness. How she would patiently tutor a struggling classmate after school. How she'd bravely stand up for someone being bullied in the hallways. As the investigation pressed deeper, every piece of evidence pointed steadily toward Hezekiah. Forensic teams carefully searched the bedroom, lifting fingerprints from the empty gun box and tracing the bullet's path to a point impossibly close to where she lay. The shot had been fired from within the room itself, by someone who knew her well enough to be there in the quiet darkness of night. The distant shell casing told a different story entirely. Perhaps shots fired to make it look like an outside threat. A robbery that had gone terribly wrong. But the witness's testimony cut straight through that carefully constructed lie. Hezekiah's panicked escape. The gun clutched in his trembling hands. His desperate attempts to blame some mysterious attacker who was never there. When investigators interviewed his friends, they discovered a young man teetering on the edge. There had been heated arguments with Chanel about his troubling habits, his constant lies, the marijuana that clouded his judgment and reasoning. Domestic violence experts recognized the warning signs immediately. The need for control, the explosive anger, the dangerous intensity that can consume teenage relationships where every emotion feels magnified. By Monday, October 20th, prosecutors filed their charges in the 2nd District Court in Ogden. They made the weighty decision to try Hezekiah as an adult, a choice that spoke volumes about how serious this case truly was. First-degree felony murder under domestic violence laws carried the crushing weight of life behind bars. No possibility of parole for taking the life of someone he'd claimed to love. But the charges didn't stop there. Obstruction of justice for his desperate flight and for throwing away the weapon. Theft for taking the Glock in the first place. Possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, connected to the marijuana they'd found. And possession of a dangerous weapon by someone far too young to handle such responsibility. The judge denied bail entirely. Now he sat alone in his Weber County jail cell. Those cold metal bars a stark contrast to the freedom he'd once taken for granted. The entire community struggled to make sense of what had happened. Evening vigils lit up the darkening sky with flickering candles that looked like fragile hopes dancing in the wind. At Good Shepherd, Pastor Stevenson led a packed service, his heartfelt sermon weaving together threads of profound loss and quiet resilience. Chanel's life was a precious gift, he said, his voice remaining steady even as tears rolled down his cheeks. Her boundless curiosity, her deep compassion, they remind us to hold our loved ones a little closer and to face the pain that leads to such heartbreaking tragedies. State Representative Galen Benyon, whose own family had been scarred by domestic violence, spoke passionately about the urgent need for real change. Recent laws had required risk assessments for all domestic violence calls, boosting referrals to local shelters by an incredible 100%. Yet the funding still lagged far behind the growing need. We absolutely must prioritize mental health resources, she urged, her words cutting through the morning air like a rallying cry. Teenagers in crisis desperately need caring providers, not impossible barriers. The days blurred together in a painful haze for the grieving Alvarez family. When the funeral finally came, the church overflowed with teenagers dressed in somber black, their young faces streaked with mascara and overwhelming sorrow. Chanel's casket, beautifully adorned with pure white lilies, symbolizing her innocence, rested peacefully at the front, as one eulogy after another painted the picture of her lasting legacy. She was the girl who had dreamed big dreams of college, who had volunteered her time at summer camp, who had loved others fiercely and completely despite all the world's casual cruelties. Her heartbroken mother spoke last, her voice cracking with each carefully chosen word. "She was my guiding light," she whispered, clutching Chanel's smiling photograph close to her chest. "Gone far too soon, but she will never, ever be forgotten." Meanwhile, Hezekiah's family remained notably quiet, offering no public statements as the heavy weight of these terrible accusations isolated them from their community. Court dates loomed ominously on the calendar as the unforgiving legal machinery ground steadily forward. Detectives pressed on with their painstaking work, searching Ogden's winding rivers and empty fields for the discarded gun. Each frustrating dead end only heightened the mounting tension throughout the city. The case, while seemingly straightforward in its basic outline, revealed layer after layer of human weakness and frailty. A young relationship torn apart by youth's reckless impulsivity. A peaceful home invaded by dangerous, unchecked anger. An entire community suddenly forced to confront the dark domestic shadows that had been hiding in plain sight all along. As the autumn leaves drifted down outside the imposing courthouse, the tragic story of Chanel Alvarez and Hezekiah Plamiwumber became so much more than just another newspaper headline. It had become a harsh mirror reflecting society's deepest fractures and failures. In those quiet, reflective moments when the sirens finally faded and the bright lights dimmed to darkness, the raw emotional undercurrents continued to linger in the air. The pure love that had somehow turned to devastating loss. The sacred trust shattered by a single, terrible gunshot. The remarkable resilience that would somehow carry a broken family forward through their darkest days. Ogden, forever changed by this tragedy, held its collective breath and waited patiently for justice to slowly unfold in the careful, measured dance of trials and long-awaited truths. Story 8. In the heart of America, where highways weave together like veins and the steady hum of industry beats like a pulse, Indianapolis was preparing for late spring in May 2016. The days stretched longer and warmer, coaxing green life from the earth and drawing people from their winter cocoons. But as the city finally shook off the last gray chill, a different kind of cold was settling into the mind of a 19-year-old named Jonathan Cruz. This was a coldness that would soon spill onto quiet, unsuspecting streets, leaving behind a trail of violence and a city gripped by fear it couldn't understand. Jonathan Cruz was shaped by the city's harder edges. A young man adrift, navigating the dangerous currents of life on the margins. To the world, he wore a carefully crafted mask of street-hardened bravado, a persona he amplified through social media. His Facebook page read like a gallery of gangster cliches, flashing wads of cash, brandishing weapons, throwing gang signs with a sneer that screamed both defiance and desperate need for attention. He had a baby daughter, a girlfriend, a mother who watched his downward spiral with growing dread. But beneath all that posturing, something dark was taking root. A twisted fantasy nurtured by a piece of fiction he was about to turn into horrific reality. The movie was Intrigue, a dystopian horror film built on one simple, terrifying premise. For 12 hours each year, all crime, including murder, becomes legal. It was a fantasy of consequence-free violence, a cathartic explosion of rage. For most people, it was just escapist entertainment. For Jonathan Cruz, it became a blueprint. The idea burrowed deep into his mind, not as fiction, but as destiny. He began seeing himself as a purger, a lone agent of chaos in a world that had already condemned him. "I purge every night now," he would later text someone, a chilling declaration that blurred the lines between fantasy and his own grim reality. His world was shrinking, his options narrowing. He told his girlfriend he needed to escape Indianapolis, and fast. But before he could run, he decided to make his mark. He wouldn't go quietly. He'd go out in what he saw as a blaze of glory, a 4-day reign of terror that would make the city know his name. He was no longer just Jonathan Cruz, troubled teen from the east side. He was becoming the Purge Killer. The city just didn't know it yet. The night of May 12th began like any other. The last light bled from the sky as the city's nocturnal rhythm took over. In those early hours, under the orange glow of streetlights, Billy Boyd was walking along North College Avenue. He was simply a man in the wrong place at the worst possible time. For Jonathan Cruz, cruising those streets with a revolver at his side, Billy Boyd wasn't a person. He was an opportunity, a target, the first step in his self-proclaimed purge. Without a word, Without any reason that would ever make sense to a rational mind, Cruz raised his gun and fired. Boyd collapsed on the sidewalk, shot twice in the head. Cruz felt a rush, the terrifying thrill of ultimate power. He crossed a line, and there was no going back. But the night wasn't over. The hunger for violence, once fed, had become ravenous. Hours later, on North Denny Street, Jay Higginbotham was walking home. Like Boyd, he was a complete stranger to Cruz, just another random figure moving through the urban landscape. Cruz cornered him. Higginbotham sensed the mortal danger and tried to run, but there was no escape. Cruz opened fire again, shooting him multiple times as he fled. He watched Higginbotham fall, his second victim, in a matter of hours. The purge was well underway. As dawn broke over Indianapolis, the city woke to news of two brutal, seemingly unrelated murders. Detectives from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department began their grim work, canvassing crime scenes separated by miles, searching for clues in a sea of unknowns. They had no witnesses, no motive, just two bodies on two different sidewalks. Jonathan Cruz, meanwhile, was already documenting his work. He sent his mother a text, not with words, but with a screenshot of a news article about the two men he'd just killed. His message was simple and chilling. "Delete those after you read it." Her response flickered with maternal fear and stark acknowledgement of their reality. "Do you know they can still pull up deleted history?" She texted back, a tacit admission that she knew her son was treading in dangerous waters. "Yep," he replied, his arrogance untouched by fear. "I may get a new phone soon, say mine was stolen." He was covering his tracks, but he was also bragging, basking in the secret infamy he'd created for himself. For 2 days, the city held its breath. Police had little to work with. The randomness of the killings was their greatest obstacle. There was no connection between the victims, no apparent motive of robbery or personal grudge. Violence for the sake of violence itself, a terrifying reality that sent chills through both law enforcement and the community. Meanwhile, Jonathan Cruz wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was growing bolder by the day. The power coursing through him had become like a drug, making him increasingly reckless and brazen. On May 14th, he took his crime spree to the next level, but this time, he wasn't alone. Cruz and 18-year-old Stephen Clark set their sights on a man near the intersection of East 10th and North Linwood. They held him at gunpoint, stripping him of his money and cell phones before brutally attacking him and fleeing into the night. Another random act of violence, another twisted assertion of dominance. Soon after, a chilling video surfaced on his Facebook page. It showed Cruz and another man proudly displaying thick wads of cash. "Get your money," Cruz sneers directly into the camera, his face twisted with arrogance. Later that same day, Cruz's growing recklessness nearly sealed his fate. He was at an East Side Wendy's with a teenage girl he'd been selling drugs to. Their conversation turned heated and she tried to walk away. That's when he snapped. He grabbed her, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. The revolver emerged from his pocket, the same deadly weapon he'd used to kill Boyd and Higginbotham. He pressed it against her. "I'll kill you if you leave me," he snarled, his twisted fantasy of control now bleeding into every corner of his life. A restaurant manager witnessed the confrontation and courageously stepped in, creating just enough distraction for the terrified girl to break free and escape to her car. This incident became the turning point. The girl, shaken to her very core, went straight to the police. She told detectives about the argument, the gun, the chilling threat. But then she revealed something else, something that would blow the case wide open. After escaping the Wendy's, Cruz had followed her. She eventually ended up at a friend's apartment with him, where he did something that defied belief. In a sickening display of pride, he tried to show her a video he'd recorded of himself attacking Jay Higginbotham. He wasn't just a killer, he was documenting his own horrific acts. The girl's testimony became the key police had been desperately searching for. Suddenly, those two random murders had a name: Jonathan Cruz. And with that name came a motive so bizarre, so bone-chilling, it seemed almost impossible to believe. The witness told police that Cruz had been talking about something called purging. The word hung heavy in the air, a grotesque reference to a horror movie that was now playing out in terrifying reality on their city streets. Investigators scrambled to piece together this nightmarish puzzle. They secured a warrant to search Cruz's cell phone, and what they discovered was essentially a digital diary of a killer. They found the text messages he'd sent to his mother, that incriminating news screenshot, and another message that laid his twisted motive completely bare. "I purge every night now since I'm dying. Someone else has to." The phone was packed with photos and videos of Cruz, posing with weapons and flashing gang signs, a disturbing testament to the violent identity he'd so desperately crafted for himself. But while police were closing in, Cruz was already preparing to strike again. On the morning of May 15th, just 3 days after his first two murders, he was driving near Washington Street and Linwood Avenue when something caught his eye. A car sat pulled over on the side of the road. Inside, Jose Ruiz sat behind the wheel of his Pontiac. What happened next followed that same senseless, horrifying pattern. Cruz approached the vehicle and, for reasons known only to him, opened fire. Jose Ruiz became his third and final victim, killed before he even had a chance to react. The next day, May 16th, the law finally caught up with Jonathan Cruz. Ironically, it wasn't for murder. He was arrested on charges stemming from that Wendy's incident: robbery and intimidation. It was a start, at least. He was off the streets, locked away in the Marion County Jail. Even behind bars, his arrogance remained unshaken. He made a phone call to a friend, not to ask for a lawyer, but to manage his public image. "Change my profile picture to me and my kid," he instructed her, referring to his baby daughter. "Make everything where people can post on my page." He was still performing, still carefully crafting the myth of Jonathan Cruz, even as the walls were rapidly closing in around him. With Cruz finally in custody, homicide detectives worked around the clock to connect him to the three murders. The witness testimony, the cell phone evidence, the videos, it formed a mountain of damning proof. On June 1st, 2016, Marion County Prosecutor Terry Curry stood before a wall of cameras and made the announcement that would send shockwaves through the community. Jonathan Cruz had been charged with 17 counts, including 3 counts of murder, robbery, and intimidation. Curry's words didn't just announce the charges. He gave the city the terrifying answer to why. He explained that the killings appeared to be completely random and inspired by the movie The Purge. He called them killings for sport, a phrase that perfectly captured the horrifying emptiness at the heart of these crimes. The random violence that had terrorized the city for 4 long days finally had both a name and a face. Mayor Joe Hogsett released a statement calling the acts incomprehensible, but he thanked the MPD and the brave witnesses who came forward, bringing the city one crucial step closer to providing answers for these victims' families. The next day, Jonathan Cruz stepped into the courtroom for his first appearance. Gone was the swaggering gangster from his Facebook photos. He slumped in his chair, just a sullen 19-year-old, as the judge's voice filled the room, reading through the long list of charges against him. Outside the courtroom, those who knew him wrestled with an impossible question. How could they reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster prosecutors described? His girlfriend, Angela Barger, spoke to reporters with disbelief in her voice. She couldn't accept that he was capable of such violence. Sure, she admitted, he had his issues. But he wasn't some kind of crazy, violent person. Ricky Claney, the mother of his infant daughter, echoed those doubts. She insisted the whole purge thing was being blown way out of proportion. They saw a troubled young man, not a cold-blooded killer. But the evidence painted a very different picture. Given the brutal and seemingly random nature of the crimes, Prosecutor Curry stepped forward with a chilling announcement. His office would seek the death penalty. The state of Indiana was prepared to demand the ultimate price for those 4 days of terror Cruz had unleashed upon the city. The case was set for what promised to be a long, painful, and very public trial. For nearly a year, it crawled through the slow, methodical machinery of the justice system. But then, in April 2017, just as the trial loomed ahead, something unexpected happened. Jonathan Cruz, the man who had fashioned himself as a fearless purger, an agent of chaos who answered to no one, made a stunning decision. He chose to plead guilty. In a complete reversal, he admitted to everything. Every murder. The armed robbery. All of it. He abandoned any pretense of a defense. The decision was purely strategic. In exchange for his plea, the prosecution agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Jonathan Cruz would save his own life, but he would never again taste freedom. On May 11th, 2017, he faced his final judgment. The judge's voice rang clear as he handed down the sentence. 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the other charges. Cruz would die behind bars. For the families of Billy Boyd, Jay Higginbotham, and Jose Ruiz, the sentence offered some measure of closure, but it could never fill the gaping void left by their loved ones. As a prosecutor noted after the sentencing, he has admitted guilt to what he has done. He will never be able to get out of prison and hurt anyone else. This allows the families to move on. The case of Jonathan Cruz stands as a chilling cautionary tale. It's a story about the dark pool of violence, the dangerous crossroads where a troubled mind meets a culture that sometimes glorifies brutality. For 4 terrifying days in May, a young man took a piece of Hollywood fiction and twisted it into his own personal manifesto of murder. He transformed the quiet streets of Indianapolis into his private horror movie. He called it a purge, but it was never a cleansing. It was a stain, a senseless tragedy that serves as a stark reminder of how thin the line can be between fantasy and the devastating reality of violence. The city moved forward as cities do, but the echoes of those 4 days, and the lives so pointlessly extinguished, linger still. Story 9. In the heart of Russia's Ural Mountains, the city of Kashim slumbers peacefully. This is a place where quiet industry thrives, where long, snow-hushed winters give way to fleeting green summers. Like so many provincial Russian towns, its very soul lives within its babushkas, those elderly grandmothers who serve as keepers of tradition. Their colorful headscarves and gentle, stooped shoulders create a familiar, comforting sight along the city's weathered streets. These women are the true guardians of family histories. They tend small garden plots with weathered hands. They form the steady, unassuming heart of the entire community. But in 2002, this precious heart began to face attacks. Methodical, brutal assaults by a phantom who would earn a name whispered in absolute terror. Satan in a skirt. The phantom had a real name, though no one would discover it for 8 long, haunting years. Her name was Irina Gay Damacho. To the outside world, she appeared utterly ordinary, just another face you'd pass on the street and instantly forget. Born in 1972, her early life bore the scars of her parents' struggles with alcohol, a darkness that would eventually flow down to her like poison through generations. She moved to Krasnoyarsk in the 1990s, where she met her husband Yuri and had 2 children. She was a mother. She helped at her daughter's school. To everyone who knew her, she seemed kind and gentle. A normal wife and mother living what appeared to be a perfectly normal life. But Irina's entire existence was built on a carefully constructed lie. Beneath that veneer of domestic tranquility, a ferocious craving coiled and writhed like a serpent. She was an alcoholic, and her addiction had become an insatiable beast. Her husband Yuri knew of her weakness. Fearing she would drink herself into oblivion, he refused to give her money for vodka. But his refusal didn't cure her. It merely forced her desperation to seek another, far more sinister outlet. The need for a drink became the singular driving purpose of her existence. An obsession so powerful, it would eclipse her conscience, her humanity, and ultimately, the lives of 17 innocent women. And so, she began her terrible work. Her days took on a grim, secret routine. After seeing her husband and children off each morning, she would leave the house, not for a job as they believed, but to hunt. Her prey was always the most vulnerable, the most trusting. The elderly women of the Sverdlovsk Oblast. She became a wolf, dressed in social worker's clothing. She would carefully choose a potential victim, often a woman living alone in one of those drab Soviet-era apartment blocks, then knock softly on her door. Her appearance was completely disarming. She was just a woman offering help, a kind word, a pretense of official concern from the state. The babushkas, women who had survived wars and witnessed the collapse of a nation, who had learned to be resilient but had not yet learned to fear a knock from a friendly-faced woman, would let her in without hesitation. They would offer her tea, as was their way. But once that door closed behind them, the friendly social worker would vanish completely, replaced by something monstrous. From her bag, Irina would produce a hammer or an axe. The attacks were swift and merciless. She would strike her victims repeatedly, the violence shocking in its intensity and seemingly impossible for a woman to possess. Then, with her bloody work complete, she would ransack the small apartments, her eyes scanning desperately for her prize. She wasn't after jewels or state secrets. She was hunting for a handful of rubles, a pension check, and any small amount of cash that would buy vodka. Sometimes she took lives for as little as 20 rubles. Over 8 years and 17 murders, she would steal the equivalent of around 1,000 rubles total. 17 precious lives extinguished for mere pocket change. She would then slip quietly back out of the apartment, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable horror, and return to her own life, to her husband and children. The metallic scent of violence replaced by the sterile burn of cheap vodka. The first incident in 22 sent shockwaves through the small community of Krashim. The brutal ending of an elderly woman's life in her own home tore through the town's quiet fabric like a blade. When a second and then a third incident occurred in the same horrific manner, shock curdled into pure fear. The police found themselves completely baffled. They had a string of brutal cases on their hands, all targeting elderly women, all involving extreme blunt force trauma to the head. The sheer ferocity of the attacks led investigators down a path that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. They remained convinced the perpetrator had to be a man. The idea that a woman could be capable of such savagery seemed to them completely unthinkable. A police source would later admit, "We believed at first that only a man could be so cruel as to act in this way." This fundamental misunderstanding of their quarry allowed the real perpetrator to operate with near complete impunity. As the body count climbed higher, the investigation spiraled into a confusing and fruitless manhunt for a male suspect. The terror spread from Krasnoyarsk to other towns throughout the region, Nizhny Tagil, Serov, Asbest. The media dubbed the Phantom the Granny Killer, the Krashim Maniac. The women of the region began living in a state of siege, their trust in the world completely shattered. Every knock on the door became a potential death sentence. Some elderly women even refused to open their doors to real social workers, the very people meant to help them. Irina Gay Damachuk was growing bolder by the day, more arrogant, more reckless. She began leaving behind a chilling signature at every crime scene. Investigators discovered numbers scrawled across the walls of apartment buildings where her victims had lived. A grim tally of her deadly work. Her 7th victim lived in building number 7 Tar. The 8th in building 8 Tard. The 9th in apartment number 9. It was a twisted game that only she understood, a haunting display of her growing sense of invincibility. But at the scene of her 9th attack, she finally slipped up. In her haste to escape, she left her hammer behind, the very weapon she'd used to end a life. And on that hammer, investigators found something precious. Fingerprints. This was the breakthrough they'd been desperately waiting for. Their hopes soared, until they crashed back down to Earth. The prints were run through every database they had. No match. Irina Gay-Damachuk had never been arrested before. She was a ghost in their system. The hammer that should have solved everything became just another dead end. Meanwhile, the pressure was crushing. The public lived in fear. Local officials demanded answers. And in their desperation, the police made their most devastating mistake yet. They zeroed in on an innocent woman named Marina Velieva. What drew them to her remains unclear. Maybe she resembled a witness sketch. Maybe she was simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Velieva was arrested and subjected to a harsh interrogation. Under extreme pressure, threatened. According to some reports, with violence by the officers themselves, she finally broke. She confessed to murders she didn't commit. The police had their killer. The city exhaled in collective relief. But that peace was short-lived. While Marina Velieva sat in custody, her confession being celebrated by law enforcement, the real killer struck again. The news was a crushing humiliation for the police. They were forced to release Velieva and publicly admit their mistake. The officers involved in extracting her false confession were later convicted of abuse of office. But the damage was done. They had brutalized an innocent woman and allowed the real monster to continue her reign of terror. For a time, investigators even entertained the theory that their killer was a man dressed as a woman. So deeply ingrained was their belief that no female could be capable of such violence. They questioned over 3,000 people. They consulted with psychics. They chased down countless false leads. All while Irina Gay-Damachuk continued her quiet, deadly work, funding her alcoholism with the lives of the elderly. The turning point finally came in 2010, 8 years after the first murder. Gay-Damachuk entered another elderly woman's home, hammer in hand. But this time, something went terribly wrong. Her intended victim fought back, managed to escape, and survived to tell police exactly what had happened. Her testimony shattered everything the investigation had been built on. The attacker, she insisted, was definitely a woman. The police were finally forced to abandon their prejudice and accept a terrifying truth. The monster they were hunting was female. Now their search had a new focus. And soon after, Irina Gay-Damachuk made her final fatal mistake. For what would be her last victim, 81-year-old Alexandra Pavaritsa, she changed her approach. Instead of posing as a social worker, she offered to redecorate the woman's apartment. After she attacked Pavaritsa and slipped away, neighbors who had seen the decorator were able to give police a detailed description. It was the final piece of the puzzle. That description led them to a 40-year-old mother of 2, a woman known in her community as quiet and unassuming, a devoted wife. They had found Irina Gay-Damachuk. Her arrest sent shockwaves of disbelief through the region. Her husband, Yuri, was stunned. "I lived with her for 14 years, he told reporters, but never suspected anything. Her friends were incredulous. "I simply cannot believe Irina is a mass murderer," one said. "She was a kind and gentle mother, always eager to help." The woman they knew, the mother who helped at her daughter's school, couldn't possibly be the savage killer who had terrorized their region for nearly a decade. But, under interrogation, the carefully constructed facade crumbled. Irina confessed. She told police everything. Her motive was stark and pathetic in its simplicity. "I did it for money," she said. "I just wanted to be a normal mom, but I had a craving for drink. My husband Yuri wouldn't give me money for vodka. There was no grand psychology behind it. No complex motive. Just a desperate, all-consuming thirst." In February 2012, her trial began. Despite her detailed confession to police, she contested the charges in court. A team of psychiatrists examined her and, while noting some mental health issues, declared her legally sane at the time of the attacks. The evidence against her was overwhelming. In June 2012, she was found guilty of 17 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The families of her victims had endured every horrific detail of their loved ones' final moments, waiting for the justice they deserved. What they received felt like one last, cruel slap in the face. Under Russian law, the maximum prison sentence for a woman is 25 years. The judge sentenced Irina Gay-Demachuk to just 20 years. His reasoning: he'd shown mercy by reducing her sentence by 5 years, because she was a mother. The courtroom exploded in outrage. 20 years. Barely more than 1 year for each life she had so brutally stolen. "She never deserves to be freed," one relative cried out. The sentence meant that Satan in a skirt, one of Russia's most prolific female serial killers, could one day walk free. Her lawyer, incredibly, vowed to appeal for an even lighter sentence. The story of Irina Gay-Demachuk is a story of stark contrasts. The loving mother and the merciless killer. The quiet neighbor and the monster with a hammer. It's also a story of a deeply flawed investigation. Of a police force so blinded by their own prejudices that they allowed a killer to hide in plain sight for 8 long years. But most of all, it's the story of 17 women whose final moments were filled with terror. Their lives traded for nothing more than the price of a bottle of vodka. Irina Demachuk was not some demon spawned from the depths of hell. She was a woman, a mother, an addict, and a murderer. A chilling reminder of just how ordinary the face of evil can be. Story 10. The first time Lean met Tanon, he was a picture of charm. It was 2009 in the sprawling mountainous province of Sichuan, a place where vibrant flavors and ancient traditions lived side by side. Life for Yan, a woman in her late 30s, had become a quiet succession of unremarkable days. She worked. She lived. She hoped for a future that might offer companionship and a small measure of happiness. Tanon seemed to be the answer to that unspoken prayer. He was confident and attentive, and his words painted a future so bright it was impossible not to be drawn into its light. Within just a few short months, they were married. The wedding was a simple affair, but for Lian, it felt like the beginning of everything she had ever wanted. The world, for one brief, shimmering moment, felt full of promise. That promise, however, began to tarnish almost as soon as the ink on their marriage certificate was dry. The man who had courted her with gentle words and easy smiles was replaced by a stranger, one whose moods were as volatile and unpredictable as a summer storm rolling down from the Tibetan plateau. The first time he struck her, the shock hit as hard as the blow itself. It was over something trivial, a disagreement so small she could barely recall what it was about later. But the sting on her cheek, the fear that coiled in her stomach, that she would never forget. He apologized afterward, his voice thick with what seemed like genuine remorse. He blamed stress, a bad day at work, anything but the darkness that was beginning to unfurl within him. Lean, wanting so desperately to believe in the man she had married, forgave him. It was a mistake that would later set the stage for tragedy. The apologies grew less frequent, and the violence became a horrifying new normal. Her life with Tanon wasn't a marriage. It was a campaign of terror waged within the 4 walls of their own home. The beatings became regular occurrences, his fists a constant threat looming over every interaction. But it wasn't just the physical violence. Tenon's cruelty took on a creative, sadistic edge. He would press lit cigarettes against her face. The searing pain, a stark reminder of her powerlessness. The small circular scars he left behind were like a constellation of his contempt. One day, in a fit of rage, he grabbed her hand, and with chilling deliberateness, injured one of her fingers. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot agony that shot up her arm. But it was the coldness in his eyes that terrified her most. He watched her suffer with detached curiosity as if she weren't his wife. Not even a person, but an object upon which he could inflict his darkest impulses. The winters in Sichuan are harsh and biting, with a damp cold that seeps into your bones. During one of those winters, Tenon decided on a new form of punishment. After a beating, he would drag her, barely clothed, out onto the small balcony of their apartment and lock the door, leaving her exposed to the freezing air for hours. Shivering uncontrollably, her skin turning a mottled blue, she could only huddle against the cold concrete, praying for the ordeal to end, for the sun to rise, for anyone to notice. But no one did. Their neighbors heard the shouting, of course. Sometimes the arguments would spill out into the hallways, the venom in Tenon's voice echoing through the building. But in a society where family matters were considered private, a closed door was a powerful barrier. People averted their eyes, quickened their pace, and minded their own business. The shame was Lean's to bear alone. Her world shrank until it was composed of little more than fear and pain. She became an expert at hiding the bruises, at forcing a smile when she wanted to scream. She was isolated, a prisoner in her own home, and the man who held the key was also her tormentor. Lean did not suffer in complete silence. She fought back in the only way she could. She pleaded with Tenon, tried to reason with him, and when that failed, she turned to the authorities, clinging to the belief that the system designed to protect citizens would protect her. Several times after particularly brutal assaults, she went to the local police station. Her body was a road map of her husband's cruelty, bruises in various stages of healing, burn marks on her face, fresh wounds from his latest outburst. On one occasion, a police officer seemed to take her seriously, even taking photographs of her injuries as evidence. A flicker of hope ignited within her. Finally, she thought, something would be done. But the hope was short-lived. The police documented her complaints, filed the reports, and did nothing more. No investigation was launched. Tenon was never questioned, never warned, never held accountable for the crimes he was committing against his wife. Her pleas for protection were met with bureaucratic indifference. She was told it was a family matter, a private dispute to be resolved behind closed doors. The authorities, the very people sworn to protect her, simply turned away, abandoning her to face this monster completely alone. The message couldn't have been clearer. She was on her own. This crushing institutional betrayal dealt a devastating blow to her spirit. It snuffed out the last flickering ember of hope she'd been clinging to, deepening the suffocating isolation that had become her shadow. If the police wouldn't step in, who possibly could? The violence at home didn't just continue. It spiraled completely out of control. Knowing he could act without consequence, Tenon grew bolder, more vicious in his cruelty. The beatings became more savage, the threats more chilling. Leanne found herself trapped in an endless cycle of violence with no visible way out. The system had abandoned her. Her community had turned a blind eye. And now, she faced a horrifying choice. Endure this living nightmare, or somehow find her own escape. The real tragedy wasn't just what happened behind her closed door. It was that every single plea for help fell on deaf ears. The end came in late 2010. Their cramped apartment was thick with that all-too-familiar tension, the kind that made the air itself feel dangerous. Another explosive argument had erupted, though by now, The reasons had blurred into one endless stream of fear and rage. But this time felt different. Tanong, his face twisted with fury, reached for the air rifle he kept in the house. He raised it menacingly, the cold metal catching what little light filtered through the room. His voice dropped to a threatening growl as he promised to end her suffering, permanently. In that terrifying moment, something deep inside Lean finally shattered. Years of pain, humiliation, and ignored cries for help collided with the bone-chilling realization that this man would eventually kill her. It all crystallized into one desperate act of survival. A struggle erupted. It was frantic, chaotic, a clash of bodies and sheer will. This wasn't about power anymore. This was about staying alive. In the chaos of that fight, the air rifle became the deciding factor. Lean, driven by terror that had finally boiled over into raw survival instinct, managed to wrestle control of the weapon. She didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she used it like a club, striking Tanong again and again. The rifle's stock became her only answer to years of relentless brutality. When it was over, silence fell. A profound, deafening quiet filled the space where his rage had been just moments before. Tanong lay motionless on the floor. Lean stood over him, the makeshift weapon heavy in her trembling hands, her mind reeling with shock, horror, and a terrifying sense of finality she'd never experienced before. The man who had been her husband, her tormentor, was dead. What came next wasn't relief, but pure panic. The reality of what had just happened came crashing down like a tidal wave. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. In a state of complete shock and disconnection from reality, she did something that would later horrify the public and make her case infinitely more complicated. She dismembered his body. It was a desperate, horrifying attempt to make it all disappear, to erase the nightmare and the man who had created it. But a crime of this magnitude couldn't stay hidden. The crushing weight of her secret became unbearable. She confided in a friend, the words spilling out in a torrent of fear and confusion. The friend, overwhelmed and terrified, went straight to the police. The same authorities who had ignored her desperate pleas for help now arrived at her door, not as rescuers, but as her accusers. Leanne was arrested, and the tragic story that had unfolded in private was about to become a public spectacle, a legal battleground that would grip an entire nation. The trial of Lei Yan began in the Xiang Intermediate People's Court in August 2011. The moment she stepped into that courtroom, she was no longer just a woman who had suffered unspeakable abuse. She was a defendant, facing charges of intentional homicide. The prosecution laid out a straightforward case. Lean had brutally killed her husband and dismembered his body. The shocking nature of the act painted her as a cold, calculating killer, not a victim. Her defense team fought tirelessly to reveal the truth the police reports had failed to capture. They methodically presented evidence of the prolonged, horrific domestic abuse Lei Yan had endured. They described the cigarette burns, the severed finger, those freezing hours spent trapped on the balcony. They submitted the police records of her repeated ignored complaints and the photographs of her injuries that had been filed away and forgotten. Their argument was crystal clear. This wasn't cold-blooded murder. This was the tragic end result of years of terror. This was a battered woman pushed far beyond human endurance, a desperate act of self-defense by someone who had been completely failed by the very system now trying to punish her. The court listened, but it seemed they weren't truly hearing. The concept of battered woman syndrome, a psychological condition that results from sustained intimate partner violence, wasn't recognized as a legal defense in China at the time. The judges focused solely on the act itself, the killing and what came after. In their view, the evidence of abuse simply wasn't enough to justify what she had done. They saw her actions not as a desperate woman fighting for her life, but as cold-blooded revenge. The court's decision sent shockwaves across the entire country. They found Lin guilty of murder and sentenced her to death, the harshest punishment possible. The verdict delivered a brutal message. In the eyes of the law, her years of suffering meant nothing. All the abuse she had endured, all the pain she had survived, none of it mattered when weighed against the violence she had finally committed. The court declared that justice for Tanam's death demanded Lin's life in return. For Lin, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. She had survived her husband's private war, only to be condemned to die by the very system that should have protected her. But Lin's death sentence became much more than a personal tragedy. It ignited a firestorm of national debate. The case, with its heartbreaking details and shocking verdict, captured widespread media attention and public sympathy. Many people, especially women, didn't see Lin as a monster. They saw her as the face of a hidden epidemic. Her story struck a chord with thousands who had suffered in silence, their own experiences with domestic violence dismissed by families, communities, and authorities alike. Lin's brother, Li Di, refused to let his sister's story end in an execution chamber. He became her most passionate advocate, speaking to journalists, activists, and lawyers. He shared the painful details of the abuse she had endured, his grief matched only by his fierce determination to save her life. His efforts found willing listeners, lawyers, academics, and human rights activists across China rallied to her cause. They argued that the court had completely failed to consider the extreme and prolonged violence she had suffered. To them, her case represented a critical test. Could China's legal system truly understand and respond to domestic violence? The movement quickly spread beyond China's borders. Amnesty International spotlighted her case, launching an urgent action campaign. The story of a battered wife, sentenced to die for fighting back, resonated around the world. People everywhere, horrified by what they saw as a grave injustice, felt compelled to act. A campaign to flood Chinese authorities with messages gathered incredible momentum. Over 11,000 text messages poured in, all urging them to spare her life. The pressure, both from within China and internationally, began mounting on the country's highest court. While Lin sat on death row, facing imminent execution after her initial appeals failed, this powerful movement fought desperately for her survival. It became a race against time. The Supreme People's Court in Beijing held ultimate power over all death sentences. The question haunting everyone was whether this unprecedented wave of public and legal pressure could reach the highest levels of China's judiciary. Could it force them to reconsider not just Lin's fate, but the very meaning of justice for domestic violence victims? The world watched and waited, hoping for what seemed like an impossible reprieve. Then, in a stunning turn of events, the impossible happened. In May 2014, the Supreme People's Court of China made a landmark decision. They overturned Lin's death sentence and ordered a complete retrial. When the news reached her brotherly day, it felt like a miracle. Proof of what collective voices could accomplish. The highest court in the land had acknowledged that a grave injustice might have occurred. It was a monumental victory for her supporters and a defining moment in Chinese legal history. The Supreme Court's decision sent a clear message. The reality of domestic violence could no longer be swept aside. The retrial would have to fully examine all the evidence of sustained brutal abuse that the first court had dismissed. When the case was heard again, everything felt different. The legal landscape had shifted dramatically, transformed by the intense scrutiny Lin's case had brought to these issues. In April 2015, the Sichuan court delivered its new verdict. This time, Lin would not die. She received a suspended death sentence, which in China's legal system typically becomes life imprisonment after 2 years of good behavior, with possibilities for further reductions. Most importantly, it meant Lin would live. Justice, this time, was tempered with mercy. The final verdict was celebrated as a landmark victory for domestic violence victims across China. Lean's case had shown a powerful spotlight on systemic failures to protect women, forcing a crucial national conversation. Her tragic story became a catalyst for real change. It highlighted the desperate need for comprehensive legislation, and in 2016, China passed its first ever anti-domestic violence law. The new law provided clearer definitions of domestic violence, streamlined the process for restraining orders, and required police to investigate all reports of abuse. For Lean, the ending carried both triumph and tragedy. She had survived, yes, but her freedom was gone. Years in prison stretched ahead of her, the price for one desperate moment born from endless years of terror. Her life had been shattered twice over, first by her husband's cruelty, then by a legal system that had nearly taken everything from her. But something remarkable emerged from her ordeal. Her story became a beacon of hope, a powerful symbol in China's growing fight against domestic violence. Here was a woman the authorities had failed, a woman they had condemned to die, and yet she was saved by something extraordinary, a wave of human compassion that swept across the nation. Her case proved something profound, that one voice, when joined by thousands of others, could shake the foundations of injustice and carve out a new path toward a more understanding, more humane legal system. The scars she carried, both the ones you could see and the ones hidden deep inside, became more than just reminders of her suffering. They became symbols of a nation's awakening. Story 11. The morning of April 13th, 2011, dawned like any other in the quiet rural community of Darden, Tennessee. Cool air carried the lingering scent of damp earth and the promise of a warm spring day ahead. Inside the Bobo family home, nestled among the dense woodlands of Decatur County, 20-year-old Holly Bobo was already wide awake. It was 4:30 in the morning, and the dedicated nursing student sat at her desk, studying for an upcoming exam. Holly was the kind of young woman who radiated gentle sweetness. Friends described her as shy, with a quiet strength and a future that seemed as bright and clear as the Tennessee sky on a perfect day. She attended the University of Tennessee at Martin, taking classes at the Parsons Center. Her life followed a comfortable rhythm of school, family, and her boyfriend, Drew Scott. By 7:30 that morning, her parents, Dana and Karen Bobo, had already headed off to work. Her older brother, Clint, then 25, was still fast asleep. The house remained peaceful, bathed in soft morning light filtering through the windows. Holly took a call from Drew, who was out turkey hunting on his grandmother's nearby property. It was perfectly normal. A brief conversation, the kind of casual check-in that marks the beginning of any ordinary day. 12 minutes later, she made her last outgoing call. After that, her phone would fall silent, its screen lighting up with incoming calls and texts that would never be answered. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came as a sound that shattered the morning's tranquility. A neighbor working outside heard a scream coming from the direction of the Bobo residence. Alarmed, he called his mother, who immediately called Karen Bobo at work, unease tightening like a knot in her stomach. At the house, the family's dogs began barking frantically, a wild cacophony that finally woke Clint from his sleep. He got up and looked out the window, his sleepy eyes trying to make sense of what was unfolding in the carport below. He saw Holly kneeling on the ground, talking to a man dressed head to toe in camouflage. In his drowsy state, he assumed it was Drew. It appeared to be Holly kneeling down with Drew, Clint would later recall. They looked like they were kneeled down facing each other in the garage, talking back and forth. Holly sounded very upset and heated. He was doing most of the talking, and she would answer back. He couldn't make out most of the words, only Holly's voice, laced with distress, asking, "No, why?" Clint, believing he was witnessing a difficult breakup between his sister and her boyfriend, stepped back from the window, giving them the privacy he thought they needed. That's when the phone rang. It was his mother, Karen, her voice sharp with an anxiety that cut straight through his grogginess. "Clint, that's not Drew," she said, maternal instinct screaming that her daughter was in danger. "Get a gun and shoot him." The command was so shocking, so completely out of place in their peaceful world, that Clint was momentarily stunned. "You want me to shoot Drew?" he replied, his mind still struggling to catch up with the terrifying reality his mother had grasped instantly. Karen, miles away her job, was frantic. Her first attempt to call 911 was misdirected to the wrong county dispatcher, a frustrating and precious time-consuming mistake. She called the house again, her voice a mixture of panic and urgency. As she spoke to Clint, he looked outside once more. This time, he saw the man in camouflage walking with Holly, leading her away from the house and into the dense woods that bordered their property. Only then did he realize his mother was right. The man was taller and broader than Drew Scott, a complete stranger. Cold dread washed over him. Following his mother's frantic instructions, Clint called 911. Then, grabbing a loaded pistol, he ran outside. In the carport, where he'd seen his sister kneeling just moments before, he found a small spatter of blood on the concrete floor. The sight confirmed his worst fears. His sister hadn't just left. She had been taken. 10 minutes later, the first police car pulled up the gravel driveway, its arrival marking the official start of what would become the most expensive and exhaustive investigation in the history of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The initial hours of the search became a blur of confusion and escalating panic. As police swarmed the property, cell phone pings offered a frustratingly vague digital trail. Holly's phone was moving north, away from her home. The signal traveled through wooded terrain before stopping for 20 to 30 minutes near Interstate 40. Then it began moving again, this time south along a different route, before its final ping registered in an area where the phone and its detached SIM card would later be found. The abduction was methodical, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. The description Clint provided of the abductor was their only lead. A man between 5'10" and 6" tall, weighing 180 to 200 pounds, with dark hair long enough to cover his neck, his face hidden beneath a cap. The camouflage he wore was a common pattern, either mossy oak or leafy wear, the kind worn by countless hunters throughout the area. The voice Clint had heard was deep and low. It was a description that felt both specific and maddeningly generic. In a rural community where hunting was simply a way of life, a man in camouflage was hardly an unusual sight. As news of Holly's disappearance spread like wildfire, the community of Darden and the surrounding towns responded with an outpouring of support that was as vast as it was heartfelt. Friends, neighbors, and complete strangers descended on Decatur County, their car doors slamming in the early morning light as they prepared to search for the missing young woman. The search parties, numbering in the hundreds, fanned out across the rugged landscape. They combed through dense woods, overgrown fields, and winding country roads, driven by a collective sense of duty and a shared fear. Holly was one of their own. The idea that she could be snatched from her own home in broad daylight felt like an assault on their shared sense of security. The search became a grueling, emotional ordeal. Days turned into weeks, and the hope that had initially buoyed the searchers began to fray, replaced by a grim determination. The community held vigils, their prayers rising into the night sky like embers from a fading fire. Holly's cousin, country singer Whitney Duncan, used her platform to bring national attention to the case. Her public pleas for her cousin's safe return echoed the private anguish of the Bobo family. For the TBI, the investigation became a frustrating journey into a labyrinth of dead ends. The intense media coverage, while helpful in raising awareness, also generated a flood of erroneous tips, including those from self-proclaimed psychics that had to be painstakingly sifted through. An early, inaccurate report that Holly had been dragged into the woods rather than walking led to cruel and unfounded rumors that Clint had changed his story and might somehow be involved. Investigators initially focused their attention on a local registered offender named Terry Britt. He fit the physical description Clint had provided and had a disturbing history of stalking women. His alibi for the morning of the abduction was suspicious. Britt claimed his wife had stayed home from work to help him install a bathtub, but investigators discovered she had gone to work, only to be called home by Britt on the biggest news day in the county's history. A palm print found on Holly's car could not exclude Britt as the source, and he reportedly changed his appearance by cutting his hair shortly after the abduction. At one point, he even told a U.S. Marshal, "Sounds like you have it all figured out," and offered to plead to it, though he never clarified the charges. Despite the circumstantial evidence, Britt was never charged, and the investigation moved on, leaving a cloud of unanswered questions. For more than 3 years, the case grew cold. The search parties dwindled. The media attention faded. And for the Bobo family, life became a suspended state of grief and agonizing uncertainty. They lived in a world without answers. A world where their daughter was simply gone. Then, on a September day in 2014, the agonizing wait came to a devastating end. 2 men, Larry Stone and Gary Tubbs, were hunting for ginseng in a remote wooded area in northern Decatur County, about 20 miles from the Bobo home. Stone spotted a large bucket overturned in the undergrowth. Curious, he lifted it. Beneath it lay a human skull. The men looked around and saw other remains scattered nearby. They immediately contacted the authorities. Forensic analysis confirmed what the Bobo family had long feared. The remains, which included the skull, several ribs, and a shoulder blade, belonged to Holly Bobo. The skull had a single devastating injury, a bullet hole in the back. The bullet had entered the back right side of her head and exited through her left cheekbone. Her death was officially ruled a homicide. The discovery of Holly's remains brought a new, sharper kind of pain. The faint, flickering hope of her return was extinguished, replaced by the grim reality of her murder. The question was no longer, where is Holly, but who did this to her? The discovery of Holly's remains seemed to break the logjam in the investigation. What had been a cold case suddenly heated up. In March 2014, even before the remains were found, the first arrests were made. The focus of the investigation had shifted to a group of local men with reputations for substance abuse and petty crime. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came from an unlikely source. John Dylan Adams, a young man with a recognized intellectual disability. Dylan Adams was arrested on unrelated weapons charges, but during his interrogation, he began to talk about Holly Bobo. He told police that on the morning of her disappearance, he had seen her alive at his brother Zach Adams's home. According to his statement, Holly was sitting in a green chair, wearing a pink t-shirt, while his brother and their friend Jason Autry were present. He also claimed that Zach had confessed to harming Holly and recording the assault, though no video was ever found. Based on this confession, the TBI moved swiftly to arrest Zach Adams, Jason Autry, and another man named Shane Austin. The arrest sent shockwaves rippling through the tight-knit community, but the case that unfolded was far from straightforward. What emerged was a tangled web of conflicting stories, recanted confessions, and serious accusations of police misconduct. Shane Austin, who had allegedly been offered immunity in exchange for leading investigators to Holly's body, either couldn't or wouldn't deliver on that promise. The deal crumbled. Then, in February 2015, Austin was found dead in a Florida hotel room, a victim of suicide. His attorney lashed out at what he called the witch hunt nature of the investigation, adamantly defending his client's innocence. 2 other men, Jeffrey and Mark Pyrie, also found themselves behind bars based on second-hand claims about a video supposedly showing the assault. But eventually, All charges against them were dropped. The prosecution's theory of the crime, the story they would present at trial, painted a disturbing picture of drugs and violence. They claimed that Zach Adams, Dylan Adams, and Shane Austin had arrived at the Bobo house that morning with plans to teach Clint Bobo a particular skill. According to their narrative, Holly emerged from the house in distress, and the men seized the opportunity to abduct her. They allegedly took her to a barn owned by Shane Austin's grandmother, where she endured repeated assaults. The case against Zach Adams, the first and only defendant to face trial, relied almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no DNA, no physical proof linking him to Holly Bobo. Instead, the prosecution built their case on a fragile foundation of testimony from jailhouse informants, former associates, and most critically, Jason Autry, who had agreed to testify against Zach in exchange for a lighter sentence. The trial of Zachary Adams finally began in September 2017, more than 6 years after Holly's disappearance. The courtroom in Savannah, Tennessee, was packed to capacity. The air hung thick with tension and the crushing weight of a community's grief. What unfolded was a spectacle of raw emotion and grim testimony, exposing the dark, drug-fueled underbelly of rural West Tennessee. Holly's mother, Karen, collapsed on the witness stand, her overwhelming grief too much to bear. The prosecution's star witness was Jason Autry, a convicted felon who took the stand wearing a white jail uniform. In a calm, measured voice, he spun a chilling account of Holly Bobo's final hours. His testimony was deeply disturbing. He claimed that after the abduction and assault, he met up with Zach Adams, who had Holly's body wrapped in a multicolored blanket in the bed of his pickup truck. Autry said he agreed to help Zach dispose of the remains. They drove to a secluded spot under a bridge over the Tennessee River, planning to weigh down the body so it wouldn't surface. But when they pulled Holly from the truck, they discovered she was still alive. It sounded like boom, boom, boom underneath that bridge, Autry testified, his voice cutting through the silent courtroom. It was just one shot, but it echoed. Birds went everywhere, all up under that bridge, then just dead silence for just a second. According to Autry, Zach Adams had shot Holly in the back of the head. Panicked by the echoing gunshot, they quickly put her body back in the truck. Autry testified that Zach later told him he had disposed of the remains near a place called Kelly Ridge. The defense team fought back fiercely, painting Autry as a desperate liar who had fabricated his entire story to avoid a life sentence. They argued that he'd been given access to the case files, allowing him to craft a narrative that conveniently matched the known evidence. They highlighted glaring inconsistencies in the state's case. None of the accused men matched Clint Bobo's description of the abductor, and cell phone records placed Zach Adams and Holly Bobo Miles apart during the crucial time frame of her disappearance. In a bold move, they even called the former lead TBI investigator to the stand, who testified that he had actually ruled these men out as suspects early in the investigation. The defense pointed the finger back at the original suspect, Terry Britt, arguing that the state had more solid evidence against him than against the men currently on trial. But Autry's testimony proved devastatingly effective. His detailed, unwavering account seemed to resonate with the jury. After 9 days of testimony, they found Zach Adams guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 50 years. His attorney later said he was both heartbroken and genuinely surprised by the verdict. Zach Adams has never wavered in maintaining his innocence. In the aftermath of the trial, the remaining defendants accepted plea deals. Dylan Adams entered an Alford plea, maintaining his innocence while acknowledging the state had sufficient evidence to convict him. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Jason Autry, rewarded for his testimony, pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received just 8 years. He walked free in 2020. But the story of Holly Bobo's murder didn't end there. The case, which had been mired in controversy from the very beginning, was about to take another shocking turn. In 2024, Jason Autry, the man whose testimony had sealed Zach Adams' conviction, completely recanted his entire story. In a video interview with a neuropsychologist, he revealed a shocking truth. He had fabricated everything while sitting in his jail cell. Using discovery evidence and cell phone data, he had carefully crafted what seemed like a believable narrative. His method was chillingly simple. He just recreated his own day and inserted Holly into it. According to court filings, Autry claimed he had done it all to escape a life sentence, following his attorney's advice. This bombshell recantation sent shockwaves through the entire case. Zach Adams' lawyers wasted no time, immediately filing a petition for a new trial. They argued that Autry's admission was crucial new evidence that proved their client's innocence. But the prosecution fought back hard. They maintained that the case had been thoroughly examined, and that Adams would have been convicted even without Autry's testimony. They pointed to other witnesses who claimed Adams had made incriminating statements. In September 2024, a judge denied the petition for a new trial. Yet the battle is far from over. Today, the case of Holly Bobo remains a painful open wound for her family and the community of Darden. It's a story of almost unbearable loss, of a family's love and a community's resilience. But it's also a story of a flawed investigation, of coerced confessions, and of a justice system that may have convicted an innocent man. The questions that have haunted this case from the very beginning still linger in the air. If Zach Adams didn't kill Holly Bobo, then who did? Was the real killer the man in camouflage that Clint saw that fateful day? A man who may have never been caught. The search for answers continues, a testament to the enduring love for a young woman whose bright future was stolen on a spring morning. Holly Bobo's story is a tragedy in every sense of the word. A haunting reminder that even when a trial ends, the search for truth and justice can be a long, winding road with no clear end in sight.